We're just about to start the meeting, members. We're about to start the meeting. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this formal meeting of the Cairngorms National Park Authority Board. For the benefit of everyone joining online, I am Sandy Bender, the board convener. We have apologies from Hannah Grist. And I'd like to extend a very special welcome to our new board member, Jackie Brereton. I know that Jackie is very much looking forward to contributing to our work, and Jackie, we're very much looking forward to working with you. Item 2, approval of minutes from previous meetings. Minutes from the 22nd of March formal board meetings. Are there any points of accuracy on the minute? None. Thank you. We'll take that as an accurate record. Item 3, matters arising not covered elsewhere. The draft minutes from the 8th of September 2023, Paper 2, National Park Partnership Plan Annual Update. At paragraph 14.1, the CEO confirmed that we will speak with Cairngorms Business Partnership, discuss their long-term plans, and come back to the board with an update. Completed. Paper 4, Capercaillie Conservation, at paragraph 21.1, strategic aspects of the plan to come back to the board for approval and to performance committees for regular updates, set up by Gaynor Roger and Doug McAdam. This, of course, is on today's agenda. Draft minutes, 22nd of March 2024, Paper 1, CEO report, at paragraph 7.2, CEO prepare a briefing note on farming activity and statistics within the Cairngorms National Park and distribute to the board. That's in hand. Point 3, Murray Ferguson, Director of Planning and Place, to write to the Scottish Canoe Society about access to the River Spey. That's completed. Paper 2, Cairngorms National Park Authority Budget and Operational Plan for 2024-25. Paragraph 9.1, a list of community grants published on the Cairngorms National Park website and circulated with members. That's completed. Paper 3, consultation on managing deer for climate and nature. At paragraph 13.2, Colin McLean to add a paragraph to the consultation on the issue of roe deer in the Cairngorms National Park. Completed. And point 3, Colin McLean to expand the Cairngorms National Park's response around the close season. Completed. We move on to item 4, declarations of interest. None have been received in advance. With regard to item 5, paper 1, that's the CEO's report, members are asked to note the guidance already circulated in the board memo for this meeting. That aside, are there any declarations of interest? None. Thank you very much. We move on to papers. Item 5, paper 1, CEO report and convener update. This is for information and it will be introduced by Grant Moyer, our Chief Executive Officer. Grant.
Thank you, Sandy. Morning, everyone. Just take you through a few of the items that are in the paper, and then happy to answer any questions about anything in there. So the first one is just the Climate Adaptation Fund, which is on the front page. We had good take-up for that. We had 52 projects came in for that fund. It was significantly oversubscribed. The panel met last week to go through that and have made initial decisions around those projects that will be funded against the criteria. So there's a good spread across the park of projects and of different types of projects as well, which I think is really good to see that happening. So thanks to Kenny and Pete from the board for taking part in that panel alongside Andy and Gav. We're now just doing some final checks and we'll be going back out to applicants very soon with offers in due course. We will be doing publicity around this at some point, obviously post 4th of July, and we'll inform you when that's happening and who's got the funding and such like, and where those projects are. So that'll be happening over the next couple of weeks. But it was really good to get that many folk involved in that. To say that Colin's been going to the different deer management groups around the park over the past month or two as they've been having their meetings and talking through the deer incentive scheme. There's been a lot of good feedback on that and some good indications that there will be uptake. So we're just doing some final work on that, and that will then be launched for the start of the season in October. The next part is just on the ranger services side of things. Two bits there, just that all the seasonal rangers are now out and about and in the park. We also have 4 trainee rangers that have been brought on, and they started this week, so they're starting doing their training, so they're with us now, which is really good. Again, that's another 4 like last year. And also some of our seasonal rangers have gone on to get permanent posts as well, or other posts in other places as well. So it's really good in terms of just progressing people through that system as well. And the other point on the rangers, just to say that the police patrols that we help the fund have also started around the Glenmore area as well. And that's kicking off with this glorious weather we're having. So that's always good. On, I think, point 19, just to say that the resident survey, the main distribution of that will happen through the Cairn magazine side of things, so that'll be going out and be doing publicity around that. So we'll let you know when that is going out as well and where people can access that, and if we can try and get as many residents as possible to fill that in, that would be great. And I think those were the main things that I just wanted to mention, but happy to take questions on any of it.
Thank you, Grant. We have questions from Chiva Blackett and Anne Ross. Chiva.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant. Could we possibly have an update on your attendance at the Scottish Lands and Estates Moorland Conference at some stage? And also just an update on point 8. They are really doing well with that path. There's a huge amount of work going on, and it's just fantastic to see how they're cracking on with it. So thank you for all the work that was done to get that sorted.
Well, it's good to hear that that's happening. And I can give a quick update on the SLE conference. Just now, this is their Moorland day that they had down near Dunkeld. The main purpose of that was to give information out to people about the new moorland licensing side of things, so the grouse licensing side of things and the Muirburn licensing. So Nature Scott were speaking at it, and the Minister for Agriculture has also got responsibility, Jim Farley, for the whole grouse side of things now, spoke at the conference as well. So it was quite a big amount of information sending out to people in terms of what they have to do before the start of the licensing side of things. And SNH took people through the actual form that they have, the online form, which is pretty simple. I have to say the Nature Scott approach to that's been really good in terms of that side. On the Muirburn side, it's a further year on, so it's not the same as the grouse side of things. So the Muirburn licensing will come in a year after the grouse licensing. But that was the main bit of that conference.
Thank you, Grant. We have questions from Anne Ross, followed by Eleanor McIntosh and Fiona McLean. Anne.
Thank you. It was relation to rangers. Last night, the HIE mentioned that they had rangers employed. How does that work, and does it overlap with the Cairngorms rangers?
So there's lots of partner ranger services within the Cairngorms as well. So we've got about 21 rangers that are Park Authority, and then there's about another 27 or 28 that are not Park Authority, so might work for National Trust or Athol Estates or Cairngorm Mountain. And so we work closely with them, and they're all part of the Cairngorm Ranger family. So they all get together, all those rangers, and they're all involved in the same things, but they've got different roles within that. So they don't overlap in that way. Hopefully they complement each other. And if there's, a big event up at Cairngorm Mountain, we would help or whatever, but, and such like. So there's good complementarity between the sort of the public rangers funded by the Park Authority and the ones that are either funded by NGOs or estates, and some of those get some grant funding from us as well.
Thank you. I was listening last night.
That's very good. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Eleanor McIntosh.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Grant, I'm going to stretch point number 10 just a wee bitty and ask about the entry points, the granite markers. They're in quite a poor state, some of them. especially ones that have got overhanging trees and the growth round about them. And it was my understanding that we had service contracts with councils, but I just wondered if that's still the case or what we can do to improve it, because I don't think it's a very welcoming impression.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And yes, we do have service contracts. So what we'll do is I'll take that as an action. I want to go and find out a bit more about that and make sure that the signs and all the stuff around, all the grass that's growing up around some of them and such like gets cut back. But I'll talk to Colin about that and we'll get that sorted out.
Thank you very much. Fiona McLean.
Thank you. I just wanted to commend the policy on supporting staff through pregnancy loss. It was acknowledged by the Equalities Advisory Panel as exemplary, and leading other organisations which haven't yet appreciated the significance of this policy. So well done on that. And I also want to say congratulations on achieving the LGBT Charter accreditation at foundation level. So lots of good news there. So thank you.
Thank you. Kenny Deans.
Thanks, Convener. Just with Eleanor's point on infrastructure, that these expressions of interest are closed. I just wondered, give us an example of some of the good projects that are potentially out there, or is that too soon for that?
I'm not sure I can say in public at the moment, Kenny, but I can certainly let board members know. So I'll do that after the meeting. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions or points on the CEO's report? Chris Beattie.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, just on point number 4, the Nature Restoration Fund bid. I'm really glad to see that in there. After the floods that we experienced last year downstream of the South Esk in Brechin and surrounding area, residents were really looking for this kind of work to be done, and it's absolutely fantastic that the park are delivering on that.
Yeah, no, I think good credit to the full partnership there in the South Esk. There's a lot of people, Angus Council and the landowners and ourselves and Nature Scott and many others. So it's good to see it all coming together.
Thank you. Any other questions or points? None. Thank you, Grant, and thank you, staff, for all that work. We're moving on to item 6, paper 2, fire management bylaws. So this paper builds on previous board discussions and the public consultation. It also builds on the objectives and actions set out in the National Park Partnership Plan. I'd just like to say a few words of context before inviting our Chief Executive Officer to present the paper. And I think perhaps the most important point is that as a board and as a National Park Authority, we've reached the stage reluctantly. We didn't want to have to consider a bylaw to reduce the risk of wildfires. We try to educate and encourage when we're working to safeguard the most precious assets in the National Park, our communities and our natural heritage. Most of the time, that's all we need to do. But several things have changed. The most significant has been the increased danger from tinder dry conditions and the very clear warnings of more extreme weather events to come. We saw exactly what that meant last year. 2 large wildfires just outside the national park, and completely justifiable fears that it's only a matter of time before we face the same. We responded with a big increase in focused ranger patrols, working with our partners. We paid for extra police patrols. We mounted a huge education programme across the media. There were signs, posters and leaflets. Most people who were out to enjoy the national park heeded the advice, and most people are thoughtful and reasonable. But a significant minority ignored all the messages and warnings. They ignored the rangers or paid lip service when the rangers were present. We even had the incredible situation of a few people carrying bags of kindling past signs saying no fires, getting ready to light fires in woods that were bone dry. It's no exaggeration to say that in those conditions they were playing Russian roulette with some of the country's most important natural heritage, with property, and potentially with other people's lives. So it's no surprise that some of the loudest demands for action have come from those communities most directly affected by this behaviour. What's followed has been the most extensive public consultation exercise that the Cairngorms National Park Authority has ever undertaken on a single issue. It's been done without this authority expressing any preference, and it's attracted one of the biggest responses we've ever received. This has included a strong mandate for action. As a board, we have been listening very carefully to the feedback from groups and individuals across the national park. And on behalf of the board, I would like to thank everyone who's contributed. And we're continuing to listen. If we do support the recommendation to request a bylaw, there will be further consultation on the wording and a full statutory process. So for clarity, the board is being invited to agree that the Park Authority develop a seasonal fire management bylaw from 1st of April to 30th September each year for formal consultation this autumn. To agree that the fire management bylaw does not cover Muirburn, because Muirburn licence conditions will cover Muirburn during periods of high fire risk. And agreed that the Park Authority continue to work with the Scottish Government to ensure that fixed penalty notices can be issued for bylaw offences. I'll now ask our Chief Executive Officer to present the paper. Grant.
Thanks very much, Sandy. Yes, so we have carried out a large consultation. There was 1,664 consultation responses to that, which was excellent. I think it's the largest ever consultation response that we've had to anything we've done, and that's excellent. So the main types of respondents were from local residents, so 58% of those were from local residents, 31% from visitors, businesses covered 11%, land managers, workers 10%. So there was a good spread of people that got involved with it. And the overall side of things was that 79% of all respondents supported the introduction of a bylaw and 16% were against. And I think that shows the mandate for change that the Park Authority has in terms of looking at what the options are. In terms of the preferences against the options that were put in place, respondents were asked which of any of the three options they preferred. 17% preferred option 1, which was no bylaw or enhanced education. 34% preferred option 2, a high fire risk bylaw, and 49% preferred option 3, the year-round bylaw. I'll come back to that part, and I'll just go through the final bit, which was around the prescribed burning side of things. Respondents were asked whether they wish to see prescribed burning included in the bylaw, with 45% in favour of that, 35% against, and 20% don't know. So a slightly different split there in terms of the prescribed burning, and I'll say something separate about that. We looked at all the bylaw responses and all the written stuff that came around that, lots of written comments as well, to really get a feel for where people were coming from and why they said different options and what their feeling was. And what we've done here is we've tried to pull together what were the pros and cons, like why people were looking at different options, and then we've come to our recommendation. So you'll see what we've said about the high fire risk management bylaw and some of the reasons why we think that is a complicated route to go down. And we've put in stuff around the year-round fire management bylaw and how we feel that might be seen as too heavy-handed, covering periods of time when there are not a lot of people in the park lighting fires, fire risk, etc. So what we've tried to do is to look at that and take, in effect, there was quite a split between people who thought it should be a high fire risk bylaw and it should be a year-round bylaw, more people in favour of year-round. And I suppose looking at it, what we thought is that the seasonal bylaw takes some of the best elements of both. So a seasonal bylaw is still relatively easy to communicate to people. So it's got a set date, set time that it ends, unlike the high fire risk where it can be this weekend there's a high fire risk, next weekend there's not, the following weekend there is, and then you need the signage, you need the social media and everything around that, which is very complicated for people to understand and I think complicated to enforce. And the seasonal bylaw gets away from us enforcing at a time of year where there are not a lot of people out in the park lighting fires from a recreational point of view. So that is why we came to the recommendation, looking at all that information, that the Park Authority develop a seasonal fire management bylaw from the 1st of April to the 30th of September each year for formal consultation this autumn. And obviously the formal consultation this autumn gives us a good opportunity to get more feedback on the wording and the specific exemptions and things like that that will be in there around that recommendation. To just go into the prescribed burning, we're obviously taking the consultation took place in advance of the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Bill becoming an act. Since then, we've had good discussions with people and especially Nature Scott, and we're looking at the fact that the restrictions on undertaking Muirburn during a period of high fire risk will be conditioned in Muirburn licences, and that in effect means that we can take that whole section out of these bylaws, because that's what we were looking to try and do within the bylaw context. So it streamlines the bylaws to an extent in that it allows us to not have to look at Muirburn specifically, because it will be taken care of in terms of that high fire risk element through the Muirburn licensing side of things. So that's why we've put in a recommendation around that. And the final part is around the enforcement side. That does depend on a change in legislation, and we're working with Scottish Government around that, which is how we can have fixed penalty notices for bylaws. I think it's really important that we get that fixed penalty notice side of things. It allows us to actually deal with things. Going through the procurator fiscal route is quite a lengthy process, and this would be a better way to do it. So we're still working with them. It's still on the cards to do that through some of the legislative changes that are coming up. So those are the reasons why we've proposed what we've proposed. I'm happy to take any questions on that. I'm sure Colin as well, Colin Simpson, will be able to help us do that as well. I don't know if Colin wants to come up to the table, so he's next to the microphone. That's probably best. Yeah, happy to take any questions from any members. Thanks.
Thank you, Grant. We have questions or comments from Peter Cosgrove, Chief of Blackett, and Elmer McIntosh.
Thank you. This is a very clear, evidence-based and well-written paper. As Sandy has pointed out, the mandate for change from consultees is particularly strong across all sectors and demographics. So I think we are being told quite clearly we need to do something. And so I think I support the recommendations of the paper. I think it's also important that land managers' concerns over the duplication of effort and potential confusion in relation to prescribed controlled burning and Muirburn has been addressed. And so basically I completely support the recommendations within the paper. And I would also highlight, because I'm a pedant, that there is a typo just so that there's no challenge later on. But under 4, you talk about a board decision being taken in 6 months' time. In 2024, so that just needs correcting for the record.
Thank you very much. Chief of Blackett.
Thank you, Convener. We've had good discussions on this paper as a board, and I think those of us that have seen the damage that is wreaked by out of control fire know that if people are taking kindling to areas where it says no fires, that actually we have no option but to do something. One area of concern that's been expressed to me, and I've said I don't think this is the case, but I would like to hear it expressed, is that we've never had bylaws before. Is this opening the door to a floodgate of them? Well, I can't see that, but I would like confirmation of that, please. Otherwise, I watched fire at Mar Lodge go out of control, where there was no burning to stop it, no fire breaks in place, and I've seen the damage it did to wildlife and to the trees, and so I completely support the recommendations in this paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief, and thanks for your comments. As convener, I've returned to the remarks I made at the start, that we, as a board, are approaching the request for a bylaw very reluctantly, but again, it's in the conditions that I've set out earlier.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, there's no other bylaw that we are looking at within the national park for anything at the moment.
Thank you very much. We have Elder McIntosh, followed by Steve Micklewright, Bill Lobbin, John Kirk, Lon McCallum, and Fiona McLean.
Yeah, Grant, excuse my ignorance on this, but prescribed burning, I know we've discussed Muirburn, but there are other types of burning that land managers carry out, is that covered by the Muirburn law?
Not necessarily. So it's not all burning, but in terms of that's some of the stuff that we'd look around the exemptions in terms of the bylaw side of things, in terms of what land managers can do on their land. Yeah.
That was my next point. That was my next point as to how that other sort of prescribed burning would be addressed.
Yeah. So that'll be addressed through the in effect where we say what it is that people can do on their land that they have responsibility for. Yeah.
In that case, I am like Peter. We've had a lot of discussion on this subject. I think we've been forced down this road, and I'm happy to support the paper and the recommendations.
Thank you, Eleanor. Steve Nicholwright.
Yeah, thanks. Strongly support the paper, and I think it's a really kind of mature approach, and approaching this reluctantly is the right message for us to say. I still have a nagging concern about March, and you know, I know Easter often occurs in March, and we don't have data about the number of fires that we've seen in March, and we do get very high fire risk days in March as well. So just interested to know from Grant whether March was considered, and if so, what your kind of analysis is.
Yeah, we have thought about March. The main, we don't have the data particularly, Steve, I have to say, which is one of the reasons why we're saying 1st of April. But one of the things we will be looking at is in the bylaw wording itself, having the flexibility to potentially amend the date. So that if there are issues that we start to gather data on that shows that the date should be slightly earlier, then we can move it. So that's the way that I'd look at doing that rather than moving it back at the moment. I think that's why we suggested the 1st of April, because that's when we know we've got data from.
Okay, great. That was my next question, was can we be flexible if we need to, if we find that March becomes a problem? Okay, great.
Yeah, that's what we're going to look at in terms of the wording that will come back to the board in September. Yeah.
Thank you. Bill Lobbin.
Yeah, you know, if you turn up from the park, on holiday into the park, and you come from Glasgow or Manchester or Timbuktu for that matter, and you light a fire that goes out of control, then it's local people, businesses and landowners that are impacted. But on the other hand, if you light it 2 metres away from the park boundary and the wind's blowing in the right direction, it's exactly the same impact. And you've nothing that rangers or etc. can do about it. So that is one of the problems that I foresee. And okay, I have to be honest, I don't like bylaws. I don't like the idea of bylaws. I don't like unelected bodies enforcing them. But we need to do something, there's no doubt about that. But I think that part of the problem is going to be how you enforce it. You can have as many rangers as you like, and you can dish out as many fixed penalty notices if you like. And bearing in mind that on the average day, I can only speak for this side of the hill, there are 2 policemen between Nairn and Dalwhinnie. Quite how the police are going to assist in this is beyond me. But I think that's just basically all I have to say. Is I think, like Jiva, I'm concerned about the potential for an exponential rise in bylaws, and I'm not convinced with what Grant said, because you used the words "at the moment," Grant, which I don't actually think is right.
Well, I used that at the moment because I wouldn't want to bind any future discussions or boards around what they may wish to do. I can't, you know, in 10 years' time, somebody might come forward with something. So I don't think we can rule out forever the board never deciding to do anything else. All I can say is that there is absolutely no work underway on any subject to do with bylaws in the national park outside of fire. That's simple as that. And we've no evidence to suggest that we should be looking at another topic at the moment either. And ultimately, this comes down to the evidence gathered to see whether a bylaw is the right way forward. In terms of enforcement, I mean, it's a valid point, Bill, around how we enforce, but the main bit around this is the messaging that you get to do before people get here, and the ability to actually say to people and make it known that you cannot light a fire in the Cairngorms National Park from the 1st of April. That should reduce the amount of people doing it. You will always get somebody who lights a fire, and then you will have to deal with enforcement. But I suppose the way that, and this is something we'll need to check in terms of data over the two, let's say we put it in place over the 2 or 3 years, But if we go from 300 or 400 fires being lit down to 20 or 30 fires being lit, the amount of that likelihood ending up in a wildfire is vastly reduced. That's what we've got to look at and see whether it has that impact or not. But the enforcement point's well made.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm speaking for everybody on the board in saying that there is absolutely no appetite for bylaws per se. This is a very, very specific response to an extreme set of threats. Questions from John Kirk, Lauren McCallum, Fiona McLean, Paul Gibb and Anne Ross. John.
Thank you. Yes, I think the bylaw is good that it doesn't affect Muirburn, and there is a couple of wee snags I see. One of the things, well, Duncan and I both have major fire problems with this steam train that runs in the summer. I mean, we've had dozens of fires.
It definitely doesn't cover that.
I know, I know it doesn't, Grant. They are pretty good, but I always worry that steam train starts something bigger, you know. And it's not going to affect farmers with dead grass being allowed to burn. You know, if we have flooding late summer, at least we can burn the rubbish off, which is quite good. The one thing is this disposable barbecues. Is there something that can be done about this? Because every fire I've been involved with around Netty has been disposable fire barbecues and the heat getting into the peat and starting a fire. That is something we really need to look at. Thank you.
Yep, and it does cover disposable barbecues, John, so that's specifically included in the bylaw. I mean, I suppose the wider point in terms of other fire risk, that's something that the wider integrated wildfire management plan would be looking at rather than the bylaw specifically.
Can the barbecue thing be emphasised in big writing somehow so that folk really do get the message on them?
Yeah. No fires or barbecues, yeah.
Thank you. Lauren McCallum.
Thanks, Convener. I've got quite a few questions, and I would agree, you know, obviously the consultation, there's a clear mandate for change. However, I think I'm in a very, very similar boat to Bill and to Jiva. I don't like bylaws. I don't like, basically, to echo a lot of what Bill has said. And I have been quite critical in terms of our communication in the past. I think it's been out of date. I don't think it's been very effective. And so I feel very conflicted in terms of, you know, I just don't think this, if it's not done well, this is not going to be the silver bullet that we're looking for. And I think park rangers will have to attend all fires, because if there's inconsistencies, then surely there's inconsistencies in enforcement. If there's inconsistencies in enforcement, then it will seem unjust. And it seems unjust, then we will definitely have a social problem on our hands. So I've got a bit of nervousness around enforcement, how we turn out to fires. What is fire? Because at Conton, it was a gas stove that started it, I'm pretty sure. The wildfire, no, sorry, not Conton, the other one. So, Cannock, thank you. At Cannock, it was a gas stove that actually started the wildfire. So what is fire? I've not got clear, I've not got clear definitions of what that is. And I think I would also just ask, just for the sake of, I guess, folks listening to this, am I hearing that there's definitely no other procedure in the legal system that will be able to assign fixed penalty notices to folks lighting fires? AKA, there's no other, there's no other process that we can use that already exists.
Thank you, Lauren. I'll let Grant answer the series of specific and general points.
Yeah.
Just on the one that you raised about a silver bullet, I think we all accept that there is no such thing, and that no bylaw and no action that we as a board or a park authority can take can prevent wildfires. We're talking about doing everything that we can responsibly to minimise the risk. Grant.
Yes, I mean, what is fire? I mean, we set that out, I suppose, in the draft bylaw text that we showed previously at the previous board meeting, which makes it clear. There will always be other things that can light fires. I mean, this isn't going to solve every issue. I suppose the main thing is that if we reduce the amount of open fires and barbecues being lit in periods where that might end up in a wildfire situation, then we reduce the ignition points and the overall risk of wildfire goes down. That's the in essence what's behind the bylaw. I mean, it's trying to get people to not do it. It's not about trying to fine people. I mean, the first protocol for any ranger with people lighting fires will still be to just ask them to put it out. It won't be a case of, it's not, the first protocol is not a fine.
Yeah.
The first protocol is education and trying to make sure that people know that. I'm not entirely agree with you in terms of the education side of things and messaging. The messaging's been pretty clear for a long time. You cannot get to Lochmorlock Beach without passing large flashing signs saying, do not light a fire. You cannot get to the beach without passing signs that says, do not light a fire, and lots of people still light a fire. So it's not a case of people don't know in certain locations. I think that there's a just sometimes light a fire. So I don't think that's that. And in the other mechanisms, there's not other ones that are available to decide on.
I've just got one other question in terms of working with other civic society groups, because this is obviously going to have to get full buy-in from national governing bodies and the National Access Forum. Can I just kind of have a bit of feedback on how we've been working with those groups? Has there been other cross-party engagement with national governing bodies, National Access Forum?
Yes, so there has through our, a bit more of the local Outdoor Access Forum, which obviously covers lots of those groups who are on it, and we've had those discussions, and obviously they've been involved in the consultation, but obviously we'll do a lot more of that if we take forward this, and I suspect that they'll probably get more involved as well when we get to the specific wording around the actual bylaw and what that says, because I think they'll want to see what that covers or not. Obviously people are involved in things like folk who do outdoor learning type stuff and what the exemptions are around that and all these sorts of things. So I think there'll be quite a lot of discussions in the autumn around that.
Thank you, and I'll just ask Colin Simpson to pick up on that point.
I would just echo some of what Grant was saying there about doing quite a lot of work over and above the direct public consultation. We have run this past like our Managing for Visitors group, our local Outdoor Access Forum. We also have a regular catch-up with SORA, the Scottish Outdoor Recreation Association. It brings together people like Ramblers, Mountaineering Scotland, Paddle Sports Scotland, etc. We ran it past them, and indeed we actually actively encouraged them to put it out to their members to get the views of quite a range of recreational participants when the consultation was undertaken.
Thank you very much. Questions from Fiona McLean, Paul and Ross, Russell Jones and Steve Micklewright. Fiona.
Thank you. I'll start by saying that I strongly support the recommendation, and I also agree with Steve that we need to consider including March. And I do think that is a consideration we should be looking at. I did notice in the responses, and it aligns with my feelings as well, some comments that this is not an issue, and as we know, that is unique to the Cairngorms. And as such, a solution should be developed nationally, which would also overcome the problem of having to have bylaws if it was a national solution. So I think what we need here really is a cultural shift in attitude, and I think that's what we need to be encouraging as well. And I would encourage us to be working with Nature Scot and with Scottish Government to consider how we can develop a national approach to this. We do need to have a cultural shift. We do need to have a better understanding of the impact that fire can have throughout the population and with visiting public. And I would like to see us working towards that as well as doing our own bylaw. So, thank you.
We're always trying to influence, obviously, what happens at a Scottish level, but it obviously doesn't rest in our hands, and I suspect we take a lot to amend national access legislation. That's the main bit. So, yes, in the long term, I think that is absolutely something we should continue to do. And if one day it changes nationally, then obviously if we did have a bylaw, we'd be able to get rid of the park-specific bylaws. But at the moment, we're not in that position.
And the point on March.
Well, I think, as I said, I don't think we've got the evidence at the moment to include March, but what we can do is, if we put in place the bylaw, is that we can continue to monitor March a lot more than what we've currently done. And if we see an issue there, then we can, if we put flexibility into the dates, be able to move the date back to take account of that.
Thank you. Paul.
Great, thank you. So I think when we conclude this paper, we're going to, essentially, if we agree, we're going to proceed with defining a bylaw. There are some things at the moment that I don't think I'm clear on, which I'm a little nervous about agreeing to implement a bylaw at this stage. So I would like to know explicitly what's included and what's not included. I'd like to know that. For example, there was a wildfire in Greece caused by fireworks. So when will we see that? Is that in September that we'll see that list of what is specifically included and what's not? I'd also like to know, in terms of flexibility, is that the board or is that an operational decision in terms of the variation year on year, depending on what the forecasted weather might be in terms of the duration? Also, the paper mentions there's a need to change legislation in order to enforce the bylaw. The bylaw will not be enforceable until the legislation is changed. And fourthly, training. I'd really like to know how our rangers are trained and if we are able to enforce the bylaw. And fifth, how do you repeal it? How long does it last? Is it forever? So there's a few things there that I'd really like to understand before agreeing to the paper, not discounting the fact that there is quite broad support for this and there is a need to do something. I'm just wanting to understand that more clearly.
Yeah, keep me right if I've missed one. In terms of, yes, so the paper that will come to the board in September will have the wording of the bylaw and what it specifically covers. Obviously, what we took to the board last November had a draft bylaw in it and what it covers and the exemptions and things in it. So it will be a model of that, but obviously taking into account some things like flexibility on dates. In terms of dates, we're not looking at changing the dates on an annual basis. It's a fixed date. There would be the ability for the board to decide if that date was to shift. So it wouldn't be an operational decision that it would be a start on the 1st of April. But let's say after 2 years of operating, we thought, you know what, this needs to come to the 15th of March. That would be a board thing we'd come back with. It wouldn't be a staff one. I've got training and repeal, but there was a third one, I think. Paul, what was the third one? Legislation. Ah, yes. So it can be enforced as it currently stands. It's just that the way you've got to enforce it is through taking things through the Procurator Fiscal. You can't do it through fixed penalty notices. So it can be enforced. You could put it in place, as the current bylaws in Loch Lomond are enforced through that mechanism. But what we're looking at is the change to a fixed penalty notice side of things, and what we're working with the Scottish Government is how quickly that can be done through legislation. But that is something that they're aware of and are looking to do anyway. So that's that one. Training, yes, there will be training for the Ranger services, and we'll need to make sure that that is in place. And that all, I suppose the bit about this which is worth saying is that it all depends on what, we've always got a 3-month statutory consultation, which if we did it from after the board meeting in September, takes us to December. We then need to wrap that all up and put that into Scottish ministers, and they then need to decide whether they want to approve that bylaw, and then we need to implement it. That is very tight for the 1st of April next year. So there's a question about whether you can do it in that timescale. And at the same time, we have to think about training for staff, signage, all the communication side of things and everything else. So there's quite a bit to be done around that, around exactly when the bylaw would come in and whether it's doable by the 1st of April 2025 or not. And then repeal, yeah, in terms of what usually happens for bylaws is that ministers ask that there is a 5-yearly review of bylaws. So there's a formal bylaw review in which you would look at what has worked, do you still need it, and whether you want to then repeal it or keep it going. So that's what happens. So, for instance, Loch Lomond are going through their 5-yearly review on their camping bylaws, I think this year or next year. So that's the mechanism for that.
Thank you very much. We have questions from Anne Ross, Russell Jones, Steve Micklewright, Sandra McDade, Duncan Miller, Lauren McCallum. Anne.
Thank you. I welcome the paper and I can see the need for it, not just in the Cairngorms National Park, but in other areas too. However, you talk about enforcement, and my understanding is that we have rangers that will be trained to have a conversation, first of all, with anybody lighting an inappropriate fire or whatever is not allowed. Then a fine will be issued, I take it, by those rangers. And then I'm going to play devil's advocate because, as Bill said, you've got 2 police officers around. So how is the police going to have the capacity to, if something kicks off between the ranger, the member of the public who's lit the fire, how are we going to have the capacity to enforce it eventually? And what happens if the person that's been served the fixed penalty refuses to pay it? So there's two prongs to that. It's sort of the end result, if you see what I mean, or people just say, you can issue me with a fixed penalty, I'm not bothered. You can't get hold of a police officer to deal with the situation. Have we thought of going it in the bigger picture as to what's going to happen from start to finish?
No, and they're valid questions in terms of how that all plays out. I suppose that's some of the scenarios that we need to play through in terms of all those different ways of doing things. The main bit I would say is that we would never ever try and put any of our rangers in a position of, not being safe. I mean, the reality is, even at the moment, if people are aggressive back to the rangers, they are trained to make sure that they walk away from these situations, that they don't get involved. That there's all procedures. It would be the same for bylaw enforcement, and at the moment, what we do in those situations is we do contact the police, and actually we're pretty good at getting the police to deal with some of these issues. So I'm not saying that it's a perfect situation. I'm not saying that in every circumstance, but I think we've got a good protocol for how that works. But we'll need to work with the police exactly how, if these come in, how that works, when it's contact, and all these sorts of things.
Have the police got the resources to police it?
Well, I think that is between us and the police in terms of, because ultimately we and the police enforce those bylaws. Yeah.
Thank you. Russell Jones.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the paper. I think it's a good paper, and I'm happy to support the recommendations, and I feel it will reassure local people in some of the affected areas, and we all know where they are. I'm also pleased that Muirburn is not included, so I think that was a good move. Also, like just comment, I think the consultation on this has been pretty good, if not very good, and hopefully all of our consultations and other things going forward can be similar to this consultation. I think that there's obviously no certainties in life, and passing this bylaw won't guarantee that there will be no wildfires, but it's a good and necessary action to take at this time. I do wonder, there has been a few people mentioned the fact that Easter moves sometimes, and about moving it back or forward 2 weeks to the middle of March if we're going to do it. And you're saying that in a couple of years' time the board could maybe think that it would move to the middle of March. I mean, would that be after some event that might happen in a really dry Easter that happened in March? So for the sake of 2 weeks, I mean, is it worth having a look at that, and is there a possibility of an amendment? Is there support for an amendment that we move it forward 2 weeks to the middle of March?
I think that the one thing we could do is we could ask the question as part of the consultation. Well, that's not a problem. See what people think. We've got a 3-month formal consultation on it, so we could specifically ask a question about that start date. Yeah. Then ultimately we can then make a decision at the following board meeting. Yeah.
Thanks. Steve Micklewright.
Yeah, just sort of following up on something Lauren said, I think this is all about freedom versus responsibility, isn't it? And how do we get to a point where people exercise their freedom responsibly? And we're seeing cases where it's just not happening in the park, and a lot of people will be affected by this bylaw who are perfectly responsible in terms of their behaviour. But I think we also have to remember the risk here of climate change and how the fire risk is only going to increase as climate change takes hold. So I think we should have to remember that's the thing. And what does a bylaw do? It makes the rules really clear to people, and that's vital that we communicate it. And people have to fear that they will get caught, and if they get caught, it's like enforcement. And I'm sorry to bring up the age-old chestnut of dog mess, but if you remember in the 1970s and the 80s, what a problem that was, and how very generally it's much less of a problem than it ever was now, at least where I live. You still get it, but it's not like it was, not all over the pavements, or if you go to France, what you see there. So these sorts of things take time, and it's about social change. And this is the park setting a signal that this behaviour of setting fires is irresponsible, and if you're caught, you'll get a penalty notice. But it's up to us to communicate really clearly that this is just not acceptable in the park because the risk of a major fire is so high and increasing. So I think we have to balance freedom versus responsibility, and I think the approach that we're taking does that really well.
Thank you, Steve. Sandra McDade.
Thanks. So I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think on the point around the bylaws and are we going to introduce lots of them, we have always been very reluctant to introduce bylaws in my entire time on the board and before that as well. And Eleanor's obviously been here since day dot on the board, and can testify to that, that there's always been a strong reluctance from both the staff and the board to introduce any bylaws, and we've only got to this position through the fact that there are no other options basically to control this. So I think the response in the consultation shows very strong support for what's being proposed. I think excluding Muirburn is correct, and is supported by the position. I think I still have concerns, and that has been mentioned by Russell and Steve around the start date. I appreciate Grant has indicated that there is going to be flexibility for change in that, and I do agree with Doug's point. Sorry, not Doug's point. Agree with. Oh my goodness, I'm struggling with Paul. Sorry, Paul. I do apologise. Having a senior moment there, like the president last night. I agree with Paul's point around clarity on how we would do that is quite important. But I do think that is something we do need to consider. I did, however, do what Russell was suggesting, look at when Easter's going to be for the next 10 years, and we're not due to have a March Easter for about 9 years or something. It's 2032 or something. So it's quite far off the next March Easter. But I think the point still stands that we can have very good weather in March. I'm not actually keen on Russell's thing of moving it forward 2 weeks. I think actually something like 15th of March is a much more complicated date than the 1st of the month. I think people can understand that. So I think if we can consult on it, I think that's really positive. I do want to see that flexibility, and actually very much to the point that's been made by others around climate change. It might get dry in October as well in the future. Actually having that flexibility, I think, is important. And just understanding when we go out, picking up on Lauren's point, when we go out to the public, explaining to them a lot of the mechanisms as well that sits behind this, so that everyone is clear from the beginning. Because quite often, I think that's actually where some of these problems come up, is that although we're maybe clear on, that there's a review every 5 years, that, how it's going to work, often they're only being asked essentially the questions that we're asking them, but actually there's a really important part around explaining the background and the context and how it will work, so that we don't get what we sometimes get of people coming around later on and saying, well, that's not how we understood it would be. But actually, for us, it's quite important to be able to point back and say, well, actually, this is exactly what we said it was going to be. So I think there is some comms points there as well. But I would welcome that consultation around the start date, and to do a degree the end date. But really important that the flexibility is there.
Thank you, Sandra. Points taken, and communication is all in this, absolutely. Duncan Miller.
Yeah. I'm just wondering how, if we are to put a bylaw through, how we're going to communicate this better, because in the consultation there's only way less than 5% of under 24-year-olds have responded to it. The 25 to 34 isn't great either. So are we getting into, places, it's obviously not working kind of what we're doing now. So are we getting into places that these age groups are? Are we going into schools to educate and communicate this as well? So yeah, I think if this is going to work, then we're going to need to really get hot on our communications with certain age groups. And I just want to echo what some other members are saying. There's the concerns over rangers and how they're going to have to implement this. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, just to say on I suppose there's a difference between what we do with age groups and the messaging we're putting out a lot versus whether they would then fill in a consultation response, which tends to skew towards the older generations in terms of filling those sorts of things. But in terms of, we're doing a lot of work with schools in around the national park, and obviously national parks are also part of the curriculum as well in other places. So there's messages we can get out through that, and then there's obviously all the work we can do through social media and other things to get the messaging out around the whole thing around fireballs. There's a big communication job to be done if we go down this route, but it's one that we're looking at what we can do. And obviously one of the key things is also for people who are maybe visitors coming to the area is the signage and where that is and how visible that is on your approach to, whether that's on the side of the A9 or on the side of other places. We'll need to look at where we put signage. Yeah.
Lauren McCallum.
Yeah, thank you, and really enjoying this debate so far, because I think this is incredibly nuanced. I understand we've obviously got a clear mandate to change. I work for Climate Change Organisation. I understand the impacts. And to Steve's point about freedom and responsibilities, and bylaws are just not in the Scottish psyche. I would argue, and in my personal opinion, I find it quite ironic, because I think almost the Americanization of our social media has actually kind of now needed this Americanization approach to enforcement and fines. But I get it. We are where we are, and we don't have any other tools in our toolbox to deal with what's in front of us. But there's still something in here about enforcement and turning our ranger service, and I've said this so many times in our meetings, from an educational to an enforcement. And I get that a fixed penalty notice will be the last resort. However, for those situations where it does get heated, and people are being, antisocial behaviour, surely the branding of enforcement, because from what I can understand, it's only the Cairngorm National Park Rangers who will be able to enforce fixed penalty notices. It will not be NGOs, private landowners, rangers who will be able to do that. So then there's an inconsistency there. So that's what I was saying earlier about, and I think if we're being called out to fires to enforce, we're going to have to go out to all fires, because if not, you'll end up with folk going to Abernethy, Rothiemurchus, other areas of the park where there won't be national park rangers, and then we could end up with an inconsistency of enforcement. I think, actually, I don't know this, but do our rangers wear body cameras? No. I would imagine that they would probably start to have to, because I don't understand how people will give a name and address for a fixed penalty notice to a ranger who's not a police officer. I just can't see that going very, very well.
I suppose all I can do, Lauren, is say that, I worked at Loch Lomond, where there's been bylaws for the past 20 years. In fact, longer than 20 years, come up with 30 years in terms of Loch Lomond bylaws themselves, and then the camping bylaws on top of that. And there's never been a need to have body cameras, and they are enforced, and they work in the context which they are. I'm not sure. There have been bylaws in Scotland for lots of different things over many years. Some have been repealed. Some still exist somewhere in a statute book somewhere. it's not. We would not be a call out for all fires situation. That's not how it would work. It's not that our rangers would call it to any fire that exists. We will patrol the places which, I mean, and you can see from the maps, there are key places where there are fires. There are also lots of parts of the national park where there are not fires happening, and that tends to be the key patrol routes for our rangers anyway, on the key times and the key nights when these things happen. So, there are lots of things that we'll need to make. It'll be a bit adaptive as we go. What works, see what works, see if we can keep making it happen. But I still come back that if the messaging and the overall approach leads to the amount of fires being lit dropping, then we've reduced the amount of ignition points, and that's the key thing around that. And I suppose that's some of the key KPIs around this is, if after 2 or 3 years of, we are seeing no difference in terms of that, then the bylaw isn't working. So that we'll know fairly quickly whether what we're doing is having the right effect or not. And then that's the whole thing about the review of saying, well, if it's not working, why not? And is it something we need to do differently? So that's why it's in there.
Okay. And then just in terms of costings, and I don't actually think Anne's question was answered in terms of what happens if they don't pay. I don't, because again, I'm just trying to understand this from a you can put all the bylaws in you want, but if they're not enforced properly, then they're not worth having. So this is my train of thought. But yeah, just again, we've spoken about the cost of rangers, how it's a very expensive service to run. Yeah, I guess my question's around if we're increasing rangers in fiscally difficult times with budgets. Even though we got our budget increase this year, which is good, but yeah, what strain that's going to put on the national park?
I mean, we're not looking to increase the number of rangers that the park authority has. I said this year I think we've got 21 rangers plus the ranger manager. In terms of that, what happens if you don't pay a fixed penalty notice? It's the same that happens if you don't pay a fixed penalty notice for a range of things that would then go into the system. So I mean, it's I can get that information for you exactly what happens, but I don't have off me here. But it's like any other fixed penalty notice. There's an escalation point if you don't pay it.
Thank you. We've had a really good airing of views, and we're looking to wind up, I think, this discussion. But Derek Ross.
It really was just to kind of endorse what Grant had said. I mean, we have bylaws. There's bylaws in town centres over drinks. Sorry?
In the outdoors, I was referring to.
Yeah, but I mean, you're saying in saying that the Scots people don't like bylaws, but the bylaws have existed for many years in different areas of society in Scotland. So it's wrong to say that Scottish people per se don't like bylaws. I mean, I'd just like to move that. I was good to move with the discussion, and we move the recommendations.
I think we are at that point, unless there are any significant substantive points. Paul.
Yeah, thank you. I do agree with Eleanor, and I wanted to support the point that she's making, and I want maybe just a little bit of clarity. The bylaw is effective if you can enforce it, and the enforcement requires very clear rules that our rangers must follow, but they must also be trained, and they must be capable and supported. And I think that's what Eleanor's touching on, is there's a risk. Sorry. Yeah, it is. Sorry.
There's a reason for these things.
I am so sorry. Yes, right. Yeah, I think when we come to the paper in September, is there the opportunity for us to say we're not ready if that paper cannot present the pathway for the rangers to be trained, the timing that it will take, and that they will be effective from the point of implementation, and that we have a comms channel in place to communicate with the public? Because if we haven't done all of that, then I do worry about agreeing to a bylaw, because we won't be ready.
Yeah, just to say, we've got a training. Yeah, so Colin and the team are on top of that in terms of training, in terms of how we take that forward to make sure that we would not implement a bylaw without it being effective in terms of our rangers being trained in time. Simple as that. So there's no there's no way that we would say a date and then go, well, we haven't done any training for Rangers. And in terms of comms, there's the whole communication plan we put around this. We're working with that at the moment with Ollie and the team in terms of that. Exactly how we do that is obviously slightly dependent on the final decision on the bylaw itself and the wording in the bylaw, which is why we need to go out to the formal 12-week consultation to do that. But that's all in train in terms of both the training side and what we need to do and the communications plan as well around it.
I would just add that the timing and progress of this process is entirely in the hands of this board. That's our proper responsibility and our duty. In the absence of any other substantive or fresh points, okay, I have a plea from Anne Ross. Thank you.
Thank you. If budgets next year, you're saying it's the 1st of April, it'll be a new financial year. If budgets are cut next year, will you still have the resources within, and I mean, I haven't got a crystal ball, but if you do have reduced budgets, will you still have the financial resources to implement this?
Well, I suppose we'll know our budget before then, and that we should know what the Scottish Government budget is usually around about December time. So we would know it ties in relatively well with the end of the consultation period and what we'd be submitting to ministers. So we would know that before we got anywhere near the 1st of April.
And we have a related substantive point from Sandra McDade.
Yeah, I think it's also just worth noting that in the last couple of years, I think maybe not so much last year, and David can pick this up correctly, the Scottish Government's grant and aid letter has specifically referenced the £500,000 that the Ranger Service was originally awarded on the basis of. So it's a government priority that we continue to fund that, and therefore would have to look at other areas for cuts rather than Rangers.
Thank you. And very briefly, a final point from Jeeva Blackett.
Yeah, can I ask, just following up on Paul's point about the communication, that when the wording for the bylaw comes to the September board meeting, perhaps we could have a draft communications plan as well?
Yeah, we can certainly provide information on the comms side of things at the September board meeting. That's no problem at all.
Thank you, board. Thanks, members. Thanks for your considered contribution to all of this. Is the board content now to support the recommendations as they stand?
Yeah.
Agreement unanimously. Thank you very much, board. Move on to item 7, paper 3, integrated wildfire management plan. And this is an interim update for the board. There'll be a much fuller paper and draft coming to the board in November before public consultation early next year. It's for information. The board is being asked to note progress on development of the integrated wildfire management plan. It will be introduced by Colin McLean, Head of Land Management. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to all. The preparation of an integrated wildfire management plan.
For anyone listening, mics are being swapped.
3 microphones to choose from. I'll take this one. So the preparation of an integrated wildfire management plan is an action within the National Park Partnership Plan. And it comes as a response to concern that a combination of climate change, changes in the behaviour of some visitors post-COVID lockdowns, and trends in land management leading to increased fuel loads, all those factors leading together could lead to more intense wildfires in future. There's no template for an integrated wildfire management plan, so we thought long and hard about what the structure and content should be, and then consulted quite widely on that with a range of stakeholders, culminating in a discussion with the Cairngorms Upland Advisory Group. So the fire plan will consist of 3 sections. Section 1 is about prevention, which is largely about the risk assessment of land holdings in relation to wildfire. It's about land manager and ranger patrols. It's about our communication and our signage, and the bylaw decision will eventually feed into that section of the plan. However, wildfires will occur at some point, and the second section is about response. And this is about people and their skills, their training, equipment, PPE, It's about basic fire plans for each land holding. It's about models of collaboration between land holdings on the wildfire issue. It's about issues like insurance cover and insurance for helicopter costs, that sort of thing. Section 3 is about building wildfire resilience into the landscape, which is constantly changing. It's about how we break up areas of continuous fuel with breaks. Where are fire breaks required? How are they created? How are they managed and maintained? And we'll discuss that sort of issue. And the timeline for completion of this plan is set out in your paper. Draft sections 1 and 2 should be ready for comment by early autumn. Section 3 should be drafted by the end of the autumn, and a draft fire plan will be presented to the board in November with a view to a wider public consultation in early 2025. So that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Colin. Members, any comments or questions? John?
Come back to when I was a youngster. Every forest had a fire break, and most of them along the roadsides, and there was always fire breaks up the centre. All these fire breaks seem to have grown over, and there used to be guys used to go around with bulldozers every year and scrape them clean. We seem to have lost that, and I think that hasn't helped the fire situation. It's maybe something we need to look at, take it back into certain areas, because this blanket cover of forestry is a real risk to the area. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there was much more attention to fire in certainly in the forest sector in the past. We used to have watchtowers built across the landscape in many parts of Scotland, and people would spend a considerable part of their summers in them, and you just don't see that anymore, probably for obvious cost reasons. Yeah, we do need to raise the issue of fire breaks up the land management agenda, and we've had lots of discussions with lots of estates about this, and people are very receptive to that and engaging in that process.
Thank you. Questions from Eleanor McIntosh, followed by Peter Cosgrove. Eleanor.
Colin, you may have told us this already, but can you define land holdings? Because as a tenanted farmer family, I don't understand how we would fit into that plan. As land holdings, are you referring just to estates? Or I'm not clear on that.
That's a fair point. I use land holdings just to be as broad as possible. I think many of the actions that come out of this plan will refer to estates, but I'm sure there will be exceptions to that. There will be family-owned farms which aren't tenanted, perhaps. And we just want to be comprehensive so that there is a basic level of preparedness where possible across all parts of the national park.
I mean, I support the idea and the aspiration, but I think we do need to be able to clarify that, because I think it does put out quite a lot of uncertainty about what the expectations are on land managers.
Okay, that's noted. We'll do some thinking around that definition. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter Cosgrove.
Thank you. Given the varying amount of experience, skills and equipment for tackling wildfires across the park, I think we should be considering long-term dedicated support for land managers for equipment and training going forward. I appreciate in your report that you have highlighted this, but I think we need to recognise that if we're asking land managers to manage this risk for the nation, because we are being a national park, the nation should also fund some of this equipment and support and training. And I think so in the long term, I feel that we should be ready to support that approach for land managers. And I would highlight that in any of our future discussions.
That's a very fair point, and the Climate Adaptation Fund is a first attempt at doing that. There was a number of project proposals applying for that fund, which are around the fire issue, so and fire equipment, that sort of thing. So yes, it's a very fair point you make.
Thank you.
Just going to add a point just on the training side, is that obviously there's a training requirement now through the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Bill as well, which is going to put a significant strain on the training resources of people on the fire management side, because everyone's got to go through it, and that's a lot of people to go through by, well, by a year's time, in effect. So there's quite a big bit on the training side which needs thought through that more at a national level in terms of how all that works, but there's certainly work that needs done there.
Thank you. Another point from John Kirk.
What the last fire in Nethy, I put it out with a slurry tanker because I couldn't get water into it. I think it wouldn't be a bad idea for the park to have a registration of folk who can move large supplies of water. There's lots of farmers with very large slurry tankers these days, and it would be quite a good thing to have a list of them in case of a big fire, because you will need to move one heck of a lot of water. The last time it was a peat fire, and the only way we could dump about 10,000 gallons of water on top of it to dampen it, it was one of these barbecues. But even 10,000 gallons of water, it was still smouldering away after 3 days, you know. So once it goes down in the peat, it's very difficult to shift, but we should have a register of equipment.
Yes, I agree with that. The big slurry tankers, the provision of water to the front of a fire is a key task for anybody commanding an incident at the fire front. That is something that the South Grampian Fire Group, which is the only active fire group currently in the park, have raised. They have that register of large slurry tankers informally, but they keep that, and that's a sound basis for the rest of the park to follow. I agree.
Thank you. Peter Cosgrove.
It was just another point that I had been pondering in relation to, you mentioned fire breaks being considered as a big part of it. Are you also considering strategic fire ponds, the creation of them, particularly in dry areas where we don't have them, and the possible role of linking in with peatland restoration projects when we were creating these fire ponds?
The simple answer is yes to the first, so definitely fire ponds. That's something we need to see the supply of water across all areas of the park if we're going to be effective in fighting a fire. So that point is noted. Peatland restoration is a slightly difficult one. You need, for a fire pond to be usable by a helicopter bucket, it needs to be over 1 metre deep. And that does not fit well with peatland restoration. Some of the goals of peatland restoration, because ponds of that size can emit quite a lot of methane from peat. So we're slightly wary about that, but the provision of water is absolutely noted. Yeah, that's key.
Thank you. Are there any other points or questions? None, in which case is the board content to note progress on development of the integrated wildfire management plan? Yes, unanimously. Thank you very much, board. And thank you, Colin, for the paper. Thank you, Grant, and all staff for work on the management plan preparation, the bylaw. It's been a collectively huge piece of work. Very grateful for all that effort. We'll move on in a few minutes to the Gaelic language plan, but we'll stop for a break now for 5 minutes, returning then. Thank you very much. Right, members, thank you very much. We'll come to order and move on to item 8, paper 4, the Gaelic language plan. So this is a paper for decision. The board's being invited to adopt the Gaelic language plan as presented. It's introduced by Ollie Davis, our head of communications and engagement. Ollie.
Thanks, convener, and good afternoon, everybody. Sorry I can't be there in person. Just to give sort of some fairly top lines on this before we'll have that conversation about it. The Park Authority, as you may or may not know, is required to produce a Gaelic language plan every 5 years in line with the Gaelic Language Scotland Act of 2005. As part of that publication, we're required to deliver a 6-week public consultation, which this time round took place between the 25th of January and the 7th of March 2024, and was made available via an online survey as well as paper and email submission options. Over the course of that 6-week period, we received 427 responses, of which 31, which is about 7%, came in via Gaelic directly. And just to give you a comparison of that, 5 years ago, we received 36 responses to the same consultation effort, and the National Gaelic Language Plan that was consulted on last year received 250 consultation responses. So I think it is worth highlighting the strength of response to this, and the fact that 32% of responses came from people under the age of 24, thanks in no small part to a partnership with a Gaelic influencer called Sorley Johnson, something that we are looking to roll out in other activity that we do. In terms of the consultation responses themselves, 82% of people agreed or strongly agreed with the priorities that we'd set out. 78% agreed or strongly agreed that the draft plan was easy to understand and follow, and a further 76% agreed or strongly agreed that the plan helps safeguard and promote Gaelic language and culture. Those that didn't agree, we got a few bits and pieces which I'll talk about in a minute in terms of the recommendations, but the vast majority said that an organisation such as ours and other non-departmental public bodies should not have Gaelic language plans, which is obviously a matter of legislation. So we have discounted that as a substantive point, but have taken on board other recommendations. You'll see in the appendices that a full consultation report was pulled together independently. That makes a series of 6 recommendations, which are on page 5 and 6, and we have adopted these in full. So hopefully that reassures members that we have gone through that with a fine-tooth comb, and we've taken all of that advice on board. Just to give you a sense of next steps, if this is approved today as a plan, it will then go to Bord na Gaelic for final sign-off. Hopefully by the 5th of July, they'll then take some time to review it and then sign it off and send it through to ministers for final approval. So that's the process. Hopefully that outlines the work that's been done so far, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you. All the members, any questions or comments? Fiona McLean.
Morning time. Thank you, Ollie. I have to say, I absolutely congratulate you on the consultation. Bord na Gaelic will be looking on with envy. I think it's fantastic to see so many young people engaged in this and responding, and also underrepresented communities. I think it's a fantastic piece of work and a good use of an influencer and social media. So more of this, please, definitely. Really good to see. As it says in the document, that it's absolutely, the timing of this is absolutely critical. There are so many challenges for the Gaelic language and an urgent need to respond. And we have to take an active role in tackling these challenges. And I was pleased to see that some of the recommendations from the responses suggested that we actually go beyond the Gaelic as a language and consider its wider cultural impact and resonance, which is just so important here, given the landscape and the Gaelic names and the the stories to be told about those names within our landscape. I think the plan itself it's getting towards being ambitious, and it's getting towards signalling strong commitment. There's always more we could be doing, but I think where we are now, it's looking. Certainly, it's proposing that we do a lot more than we've done in the past, and I'm really pleased to see that. I do feel that we could be supporting more in terms of how the communities take this forward, and I note that the sort of community heritage forum is going to be used as a vehicle, but I just wondered how we're going to actually encourage that, because it doesn't really give a sense of where that'll be taken. The corporate initiatives, I think, are looking good. Again, always could be doing more. Where's the board training? I haven't had any yet. I'd like to find out about that. I think that would be really important. I think the way in which we've encouraged partners to get involved is really good, and I would suggest let's do more of that. Let's get our partners more on board. There's more they could be doing. Let's work on that, but a really good start as far as that goes. In terms of our resource, there's going to be a young person coming in to help us, hopefully. It would be good to see a bit more resource within the organisation in terms of how we develop our Gaelic within the organisation. But yeah, I really welcome this. Really pleased to see it. I just feel we can always be doing more. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. All the several points there if you want to pick up.
Yes, thanks, Fiona, and I'll pass on the thoughts on the consultation to the team, so thank you for that. In terms of, just correct me if I miss any of these, Fiona, but I think you'd mentioned that question about how communities are going to be supported via the Cultural Heritage Network. The main thing to say there is that a piece of work was done, as board might remember, by Scotto as an independent consultant on the Cultural Heritage Network. That's come back with a series of recommendations which the team are working through just now. This is one of the key layers of that. So we're still working out the full details of that, but I suspect it'll take the form, at the very least, of an annual conference in that space, with Gaelic as a key element of that, but we're still working up the details. So we'll obviously come back once we've got a little bit more info on that front. Board training, I'll take that back. We did staff training about 3-4 months ago with Ryan, actually, who delivered the independent report for us, who was brilliant. And used to be of this parish, so we can absolutely look to repeat that again for the board, and will do so in due course. In terms of getting partners more on board, I think you're exactly right on that, and hopefully you'll have seen the provision in the plan for things like all of our memorandums of understanding and SLAs and the like. We are bolstering those to ensure that Gaelic provision is in there. So, for example, just now we're going through with the Cairngorms Business Partnership with their annual returns, and that sits at the heart of delivery in here, both in terms of the marketing effort and their engagement with businesses, encouraging them to use the language. So we're very much looking, if you'll excuse the sort of phrase, the next layer out of the onion, as it were, and how we can influence those that have influence with other groups. So that's definitely something that we'll be looking at in due course. And then I think your final question was about more resource in the organisation for Gaelic. Now, we all know that budgets are always tight on this. We'll always be pushing as much as we can. We're absolutely committed to continuing the Gaelic intern piece in the full perpetuity of this plan. I think the one thing that I would flag that has been definitely an issue for us in the last certainly 3.5 years I've been here is that with only 3% of residents in the national park speaking Gaelic, we do have a challenge in recruitment, and we've experienced that on numerous occasions. So we've had to be quite creative on that front in terms of how we seek candidates and promote those. But we have also had chats with the board about whether there's opportunities for collective resource for NDPBs to draw upon which certainly in my view would be advantageous if we're going to effectively get, because all of us are having the same collective challenge, I think, with that recruitment piece. So hopefully I've answered all your questions, Fiona, but do come back if not.
Thank you. I'll leave that if you're satisfied with responses. We have questions or points from Jackie Brereton, Lauren McCallum, Steve Micklewright, Duncan Miller and Dan Ross. Jackie.
Thanks, convener. Hi, Ollie. I really enjoyed reading those papers because it's such a huge opportunity. As a question and a couple of observations, the question was why you think there were a relatively low number of businesses responded to the consultation. And I suppose the observations would be that this is a huge opportunity for businesses in the park, whether they're in tourism or otherwise, obviously to attract visitors who are coming from other Gaelic cultures or who are interested in Gaelic culture, and the opportunities for partnership with communities in places like Canada, etc., where Gaelic's actually, I think there's a stat somewhere that there's more Gaelic speakers in some of these other countries than there are in Scotland. But I think the point that one of the suggestions I would make as well is that I think one of the reasons businesses don't get so engaged is the costs of perhaps translation and or just being able to promote their businesses. But the introduction of some of the more advanced artificial intelligence apps would allow many of them to do that translation very cheaply, cost effectively, and that's maybe something that the park could encourage businesses, and some of the organisations in the park could help businesses to do that.
Thanks, Jackie. Ollie.
Yes, thanks for that, Jackie. Yeah, so I think it's a really good question about the low number of businesses responding. I suppose the general point I'd make there is that it's been a pattern for a few of our consultations in the recent past, and I think partly that will clearly be due to capacity, but we'll also keep under review how that works. I think there's some similar conversations we're having, for example, on the business barometer take up with CBP, which has declined relative to previous periods as well. So we're keeping that under review and in discussion with the business partnership. I think there's a really prosaic reason here as well in terms of the business partnership going through a wee bit of change in terms of their staffing structure, so they weren't able to give it as much of a push as they've done with some other consultation methods, but again, it's something we'll keep under review and see how we go for future ones. Very interesting point about AI, and we'll obviously keep that very much in mind as we explore options. I have to say, in terms of translation costs, what's interesting actually is that the board have been Bord na Gaelic, have been very useful in sharing a list of approved translators, and they are extremely cost effective. Actually, we've been looking at costs of sort of even £40–50 in many cases for quite substantive bits of translation. So whilst it's not going to be for every business, and we will try to provide resources where appropriate and possible for businesses to use, I think there is also a piece of work there around the actually communicating the affordability relatively of that translation service as well.
Thanks, Ollie. Lauren McCallum.
Yeah, thank you. Good work, Ollie, from yourselves and the team. And just to build on some of Fiona's points, taking this beyond the language and the culture, and the wisdom in terms of our approach to land management, nature, etc., that lends itself to Gaelic so naturally, or is at the core of Gaelic, I think is really important as we can use that wisdom to tackle some really big problems. So I totally agree with seeing this not just as a language, but how we can genuinely adopt the culture. Yeah, well done on getting the TikTok influencer. I think I remember us speaking about it last time this was in front of the board, and I just want to highlight that. If we can use the right people who have the right finger on the cultural tone, who are good storytellers, we don't have to do it ourselves. We can get out into the communities, and that, I guess, let's call it B to B to C because I can't think of another analogy just now, but that going and working with another influencer to then infiltrate those communities can be really effective. So I'm not sure how much this certain influencer cost in terms of per post, but again, in terms of wildfire and the issues that we spoke about this morning, we would really like to see this approach adopted across other areas of work, because as you've seen, what was it, 1,000% increase? I mean, that's quite something. So yeah, I would just like to say congratulations, and would really like to see that approach embedded in other areas of the park work.
Thanks, Lauren. And joining up Lauren and Jackie's points, perhaps there's an opportunity to use business influencers in the same manner to boost responses across our consultations. Steve Micklewright.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. Really amazing response to the public consultation. Really good to see. I think it's a reflection of both effort and perhaps interest in Gaelic, and that's really good. And I think also considering the national park aims are natural heritage and cultural heritage, I think the whole point around to revive a language, you've got to make the culture relevant and you've got to celebrate that culture. And I think we've got a lot to do in the national park on that. And £5,000 a year and 0.1 of a full-time equivalent, I'm sorry, seems very low to me. So I know we've got tight budgets, we've got a lot we're trying to do, but if we can come back to Gaelic as a much bigger piece at some point, that would be really useful, I think, for the board to consider.
Thanks, Steve. Questions from Duncan Miller, followed by Anne Ross. Duncan.
Yeah, my point is just really to kind of replicate what Lauren said, and it's just really good to see, Ollie, that 50% is under 34 that have responded, and I think that we just need to like mimic that in other areas of what consultations we're using. So yeah, I think that's really good to see.
Thanks, Duncan. Anne Ross.
Thank you, and a very interesting paper. A couple of things that I'd just like information or to be able to comprehend. Fiona mentioned she would like, and please correct me if I'm misquoting, a wider cultural impact. I wonder if how would we go about that? How, if that could be defined, please. And secondly, board training. What would that be? What would that involve, please?
Ollie.
Thanks for that, Anne. I'm not quite sure what you mean by wider cultural impact. I'm sorry, I might have missed that, but happy to come back on that. I'll answer the second question first, though. In terms of board training, what's probably going to involve that's probably going to involve, I think it was a half-day session from memory with staff that was delivered, as I say, a few months ago, and that combined some basic background, some background into the language and crucially the culture of Gaelic and its resonance within the national park specifically. It involved a wee bit of some simple phrases and introduction to various things, and then it involved some pointers around further research and resources that are available to people. So quite a practical session, but that very importantly mixed language and, as we've heard from a number of people, which I totally agree with, that cultural heritage piece as well and how it resonates within the national park.
Thank you. Peter Cosgrove.
Thanks for the report, and yes, excellent response rate, noted, well done all. I'd like to echo Fiona and Steve's point that a £5,000 annual budget is quite paltry and should be substantially increased. I just do not think that's sufficient to celebrate Gaelic culture in a meaningful way.
Thank you. Any other points or comments? John Kirk.
Believe it or not, I did Gaelic at school, and the words I still remember I couldn't use around this board table today. It's great to see the youngsters coming up. My mother's family all spoke Gaelic from the West, and that was their first language, but unfortunately she never passed it on to us, and as a 14-year-old I wasn't really interested in Gaelic. But it's good to see it, and it's nice to be for the park to encourage it, and if people are willing to learn and take our culture forward, it's a great thing.
Thank you, John. And I think in the absence of any other comments or is the board content to adopt the Gaelic language plan as presented and to note the sizeable response to the consultation? All agreed. Thank you very much. And thanks again, Ollie, for the paper and for all your work in this. We're moving on to item 9, paper 5, Capercaillie Emergency Plan. So this work builds on the discussions at board and also the direction from the Scottish Government on the development and delivery of an emergency plan. The Park Authority and Nature Scot have worked with many stakeholders to produce the plan and to look for the resources to help deliver it. It's for decision, and the board is being asked to agree that the emergency plan meets the request from the Scottish Government to continue investment in landscape scale restoration of pinewood habitat, develop a cost and spatially explicit plan and funding strategy, and undertake a pine marten population survey. And the board is being asked to agree that the funding strategy is appropriate and sufficient to meet requirements. It's introduced by Andy Ford, Director of Nature and Climate Change. Andy.
Thanks very much, Convener. I won't go into great detail about the previous work on Capercaillie, but I do think it's worth mentioning the context of the Capercaillie framework, which was produced about 10 years ago by the Park Authority, which covered a wide range of issues to do with species conservation. From that was born the National Lottery Heritage Funds project, which targeted certain elements of the Capercaillie framework, notably working with communities, working with people and the contribution they can make to species conservation, and especially around disturbance. And then the more recent work by the Nature Scot Scientific Advisory Committee, which took an academic approach to looking at the drivers of decline with a literature review, etc. There's a combination of all of those things that's come together in the emergency plan. The emergency plan is specifically a request from Scottish Government for Nature Scot and the Park Authority to work together with stakeholders to maintain the long-term investment in habitat, to produce a spatially costed plan, and to do a pine marten population study. The strategic context is reflected in the National Park Partnership Plan commitments that we have. We have commitments in the corporate plan, and there are commitments in the Cairngorms Nature Action Plan to work on Capercaillie conservation and, in some cases, specifically the emergency plan. So in line with that request from Scottish Government, we've been working with stakeholders over the last 18 months or so to identify a range of activity to improve the habitat, implement some new actions over the next 3 to 5 years, and to do bits and bobs of further research. The actions in the plan, which are set out in the scope of activity, have come from that expert feedback to the Park Authority. So it's a question really, are the board supportive of the recommendations made by the expert stakeholder group? Do those areas of work outlined in the content of the plan, do those areas of work meet the scope and the requirements that the Park Authority has been charged with or requested to deliver? That should be borne in mind, or those areas of work should be borne in mind with the funding strategy, which goes hand in hand with the actions. And the funding strategy, what is being proposed, the recommendation is that public funding should be targeted at the long-term restoration of Capercaillie habitat, so habitat expansion and habitat enhancement, and that includes fence removal, because habitat restoration delivers the multiple benefits, not single species conservation benefits, and that we should be rather looking at the big, broad picture rather than focusing on the specific needs of Capercaillie. Habitat expansion and restoration delivers for Capercaillie, but it also delivers a much wider range of public benefits. I think that largely is all I was going to say, because those are the two bits about the emergency plan that board are being asked to consider: the scope of activity and the funding strategy.
Thank you, Andy. Now open for comments and questions. First from Jeeva Blackett, then Eleanor McIntosh. Jeeva.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. The first thing is I'm a bit perplexed as somebody who gets papers rather than internet in my one page of the Capercaillie emergency plan, and I see Derek and Anne with the same problem. So we don't actually have that in front of us.
According to Gavin.
Okay.
So, right, sorry, Andy. Yeah, so board were asked to consider the strategic aspects of the plan, hence that was why the scope of activity was passed on to members as the appendix. The actual content of the plan has, as I say, been developed by the expert stakeholders and the academics behind it, so they're the ones who've determined what would be the right mechanisms and activity that was in it. Board are being asked to consider whether or not those areas of work are the right areas of work that should be within the scope of the plan. Board members are not being asked whether or not the experts have got it right in the way in which they're carried out.
Okay.
Understood, Chiba.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. In 10.C, we know from our previous discussions in this room that the Minister at the time went against her own scientific advisors. Over 30 years, literally millions of taxpayers' pounds and euros have been thrown at trying to reverse the Kappa-Cayley decline, and we're failing. The risk register at point 17 states that there is a high risk of local extinctions. Well, if we do not act bravely and support what the government scientific advisors are saying, the pine marten will continue to munch their way through the few remaining birds, chicks and eggs. At 19, how much time? I have really, reading what I've read and knowing what I know and having lived with this Kappa-Cayley issue for almost 31 years now, I will only be able to agree the recommendations in A if we have an amendment to include pine marten controls as the scientific advisors are recommending. I'll leave it for others to comment.
Andy? Yeah, so the paper sets out the scope of the emergency plan as set by Scottish Government, and that quite explicitly gives us a mandate to, let me just check the exact wording, to not progress action to control protected predator species for Kappa-Cayley, but that a pine marten population survey is undertaken to better understand the size of the population. So the scope of the emergency plan is very clearly set by Scottish Government. The thing that I would add is within that scope, that reducing the impacts of predation is comprehensively covered within that scope. So diversionary feeding, for example, was something that was recommended by the Scientific Advisory Committee. It was one of the 4 actions recommended by the committee that we should progress. And the early results, well, actually, it's a published peer-reviewed result now, is that diversionary feeding has a predicted decrease of 82.5% on nest predation. So there is some really exciting scientific work coming out that's showing that reducing the impacts of predation, which is absolutely acknowledged as a really important factor, can be delivered in other ways than the lethal control of protected species.
Thanks, Andy. Elmer McIntosh.
Yeah, now from the very first questions, I'm confused if I'm going to be stepping out of the context of what we're being asked about or not, but I'm going to give it a shot. This bird has had so many millions of pounds ploughed into it, and we're not winning the battle. And if we're calling this an emergency plan, and I take on board that it's experts well beyond my level of understanding about Kappa-Cayley that have put it together. But what I fundamentally can't believe is that we're not ramping up the issue of importing a population of birds to support what we've already got here before they're actually gone from here and we'll have to look at a whole reintroduction programme. I just don't get that at all, and I wondered why that hasn't been ramped up the agenda. Because from that SEC report, the habitat was good. That wasn't the reason that they were declining. So I think increasing the woodland cover is great for general biodiversity, and I totally take that on board. but I don't think that's actually addressing the Capercaillie emergency, and I just wondered what you thought on that.
Andy.
Yeah, so a couple of, well, the easy bit, well, relatively easy bit first, which is about reinforcement. So that is covered in the emergency plan. It's perhaps not clear in that it's called genetic reinforcement, because that's a very specific term. But that does say that we need to further investigate the translocation reinforcement of a population. So there are still questions around that, because as we've discussed before, it's certainly by no means a straightforward process, but it is covered in the emergency plan, is the need to look at that at speed. So that is in there, but it's called genetic reinforcement.
I know it was in there, but I didn't think it was ramped up the agenda enough.
Okay, that's fine. We can certainly look to make sure that the emergency plan recognises the importance of that and draws it out to make it clear that that's part of it.
I was just going to say that there has been, I think, quite recently an application to reinforce populations in France, which is going through some interesting legal challenges at the moment as well. So there's something to keep an eye on there in terms of what's happening on the continent.
Thank you. We have contributions from Derek Ross, Bill Lobbin, Russell Jones and Steve Micklewright. Derek.
Again, like Eleanor, I'm no expert on this, but I have to concur with Jiva. I mean, I witnessed a pine marten at work. We've got a very large hedge outside our house, which supports quite a large bird population nest. And it just went through every nest. It was surfing every nest and took the eggs from them. I witnessed it from our bedroom window. I mean, extraordinary to see. But, you know, I mean, I think John Kirk said at a previous meeting, the pine marten population has exploded. It used to be confined, I think John's absolutely right, confined to more western Scotland, but they've moved further east, and they are incredibly voracious. I mean, they really are. And I mean, you know, I don't think we have to monitor them. I mean, I think we have to say, well, they are one of the main reasons that the population is declining. Because it seems to be that as the pine marten population has grown, the Capercaillie population has declined. And I think we have to try and recognize. As I say, I'm clearly not an expert on it, but you know, you don't have to be Brain of Britain to realise that.
Andy. Yeah, so I think that when bearing in mind the decisions around this, there are a number of factors around predator management. First of all, in terms of reducing the impacts of predation, diversionary feeding is a new technique. It's been peer reviewed. It's demonstrated that there's an 82.5% increase in predicted nest survival, and that is because of reducing the likelihood of pine marten predating nests. So that's a brand new piece of work which we shouldn't discount based on the evidence of reducing the impacts of predation. Secondly, that's why the pine marten population study is part of the scope of the plan, so that we do understand how many there are, because there are a number of policy tests and principles which would need to be applied before you can do any control of a protected species. And one of those policy tests and principles is an understanding of the population as to how many of it could be removed without having a negative impact on its conservation status. So there is a piece of work there that needs to be done first. And I think the third point is that a lot of those academic studies that were done on the impacts of fox and crow control, for example, took place in quite a different landscape to what we have now. We do have a different landscape. We have more protected species in that predator guild. And what we're proposing is that we look again fresh, because fox and crow control is in the emergency plan, look at how impactful that is in the changed landscape. So there is lots of work going on around reducing the impacts of predation, not least understanding more about what the current landscape is like.
Thanks, Andy. Eleanor's looking for clarification on the second point that she'd raised. Eleanor.
So if I remember that correctly, and it was around public money and how we should be targeting. Yeah, so that's the rationale behind the funding strategy which members are being asked to look at, which is that we shouldn't be putting public money, or should we be targeting public money on single species interventions, and that we should be targeting public money on that which delivers much more widely across a range of public policies and outcomes.
So how do we tie that up with this being a Capercaillie single species emergency plan?
Because we know that habitat loss and degradation is one of the drivers of decline, and we know that disturbance is one of the drivers of decline, and by having bigger, more connected, less disturbed, less fragmented forests, that will reduce the impacts of disturbance. And we've also seen that where we have got new forests, we've seen Capercaillie moving into those new and expanded forests. So it's a meta population that works at a landscape level, and the ability to have more of a landscape within which Capercaillie can move around to manage the impacts of disturbance, for example. We know they move from lek to lek, etc. That is the rationale behind having bigger, better connected forests, which we know that the work that was done 10 years ago to plant forests is now where Capercaillie are.
Thanks, Andy. Bill Lobbin.
Yeah, when I joined the park board first over 10 years ago, we were sitting around the table talking about Capercaillie. And over those 10 years, or certainly 5 of those 10 years, I've been listening to people who know an awful lot more about Capercaillie than I do. But that wouldn't be very difficult because it's not my specialist subject. But over that period, we've spent huge amounts of money, and we've divided communities, and yet we've had little, if any, impact on the species. You know, we're doing something wrong. Maybe the solution is bringing in a large quantity of new birds that was done the same as was done last time, or predation control. And surely predation control must be part of this emergency, rather than just, let's say, well, let's just spend huge amounts more money and we'll do another survey to see how many predators there are. So it seems to be fairly obvious to those in the know that predator control must be part of this.
Andy?
Yeah, we'll just go back to previous comments about the scope of the plan which we were asked to deliver from Scottish Government, to go back to looking at reducing the impacts of predation through alternative means, and also say that there are a number of policy tests and principles which would need to be applied before we looked at the control of protected species. But that is a conversation that, if board members feel, strongly as a recommendation, quite happy to pick that conversation up with NatureScot and do further investigation into what policy tests and principles might look like. But that clearly is a role for NatureScot and Scottish Government. But if the Park Authority is to work with them, that's a reasonable recommendation for us to take away.
Thank you. Russell Jones.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm struggling with this as well, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't know how much money's been spent and how many success measures have been missed in the Capercaillie project over the last 30 years, as they've said. And I mean, I've lived here all that time, and we read about it and hear about it, and as has been said, it's affected communities. A year ago at this board, I mean, I asked about the pine marten population and about controlling pine martens, and was told that you didn't know how many pine martens there were. The following week in the Strathy, in the same page as the article about this meeting, underneath it, there was an article about an FLS conference in Aviemore where they'd been talking about pine marten population, and they named how many pine marten they thought were in Scotland. So if they knew how many pine marten in Scotland, they must have known how many pine marten there were here. And we just seem to be kicking the can down the road when we're now saying a year later that we're going to have a pine marten survey. So, I mean, I was speaking to someone the other day who, and I'm not an expert in Capercaillie, I'm not an expert in pine marten, but somebody on good authority told me the other day that pine martens can go up 60 trees in one night, and will absolutely rip the nests out of 60 trees in one night. So again, I mean, I struggle if we're not going to involve lethal predator control in this, then I would struggle to support it. And I mean, if we agree this today, and more money is spent on Capercaillie, and it fails again, then the narrative will be that the board authorised officers to spend the money and they went out and then did it. So it will come back to us again. So I struggle with it as it stands at the moment in this paper.
Thank you, Russell. Steve McElroyd. Oh.
Yeah, difficult one. I would say that the habitat measures are exactly where public money should be going. I really support that. I think the whole reasons for the causes of capercaillie are really complicated, and predation might be an issue, fencing, disturbance, habitat, climate change. It's a really complicated one. But I would just remind board members, if you're going to take lethal control out on a protected species that once used to be extremely rare, you're going to have a really good justification for that to get that through. And there is a hierarchy of control over animals that are causing problems. So you start with mitigation and management, or you can attempt to remove them. And the last resort for a protected species is lethal control. So if you go down that road, you're going to have to absolutely prove that you've tried all the other measures that you possibly can, and diversionary feeding at the moment seems like a measure. But I absolutely agree that they are in a perilous state, and do you act almost like preventatively on these predators, or do you make sure that you know as best as you possibly can that that really is the issue that people think it is? Because I think it's very, very hard to prove that. And the population survey, the diversionary feeding right now, feel like the right approach to me, because to take a measure like this on a species that was once extremely rare in Scotland and is now recovering, and unfortunately predators do what predators do. They do take a lot of stuff. I have them in my garden playing, and gosh, you know, you think what are they doing to the lovely nesting birds and the trees not on the ground. It's a problem psychologically, but if we're going to take action, we have to absolutely know as best that we can that it's the right actions to take. And I would say, don't think we know that yet.
Just in this general and developing, or I should say repeating point, we are a board and a park authority who operate on an evidence-based basis, but I'm hearing loud and clear messages from members. Can I just take the mood of the meeting just now? Is the park authority content to go back to Nature Scot to revisit the issue of control the protected species, specifically pine martens?
I think just two things here. So one is we were asked to do a bit of work by Scottish Government within a scope, which we've done, which did not include pine marten control. The only way that you can get to a position where if you want to do pine marten control is to know the population levels within the park, because you cannot apply for a license to control a species that you do not know how many you've got. And you need to do the scientific work to work out how many you would need to take, and also what impacts that have on other predators. Because the reality of this is it's not as simple as if we just knock some pine marten on the head, capercaillie will survive. You know, there will be questions that will come up immediately about badgers. There will be questions about other things, and we'll get into that whole thing, which is, well, if we keep on culling everything, eventually we'll have lots of capercaillie. Well, that might be true. We kill everything, we'll probably have lots of capercaillie. But is that actually what we're really wanting? So I think you've got to be really, really careful here about what it is that we're actually requiring here. What we've got in the emergency plan at the moment is that next step, which is we will have a population survey done. We will know how many pine marten we have, and then we need to do some work around that as to what it is that you would do, that how many pine marten in effect would you have to kill to have any impact on the capercaillie population. And again, I come back to it's not as simple as it's just pine marten, because the population in Deeside plunged and disappeared almost when there were no pine marten in Deeside. So the idea that it's just a link between the two is not right. So we've got to be really, the influence of predators on things is not as simple as one species, and if we just do that, it is a whole manner of different things. But if we don't do the population survey, there is no next step. There is no we go back to Nature Scot. If we went back to Nature Scot just now and said we want to, as a board, to cull pine marten, the answer will be no, because there is no evidence for us to do that. We've got to take that next step. I do think there's a conversation to be had around this, but we need to do that population survey, which is part of the emergency plan, and then we need to make some decisions on whether the board at that point wants to take forward an approach to Nature Scot, but ultimately it's not our decision. It would be for Nature Scot and Scottish Government as well on that front. So I think we've got to do what is within scope and what Scottish Government have asked us to do as an NDPB of Scottish Government, And then at that point, if we get the evidence that suggests that there is something we can do that makes sense financially and from a resource point of view and ecologically, then we might take that next step. But we need that first part, or it's sort of, we're just going to go around in circles forever because there's nothing to base it on.
Yeah, I'll repeat the point that we are an evidence-based organisation, and any actions that we take or recommendations that we make, Chiva wanted to come back on that point.
Yeah, first of all, I want to clarify the fact that I'm not arguing for lethal control. There is such a thing as translocation. And if you are using diversion refeeding and you don't know how many pine marten you're providing breakfast for, where are you going to do it? Are you going to do it round the Lek? Because that will bring in every other predator looking for a free jam sandwich. All I can see here is more and more money being thrown at things, at a bird. I mean, literally, you know, when Simon became the Invercool factor 31 years ago, there was a Capercaillie Life project from the EU. We are no further forward. Although there are a few birds in Deeside, but, you know, the pine marten have been there for probably 25 years, which is part of the crash. I just cannot get my head around throwing more money at this. And I stress, I'm not arguing for lethal controls. You know, there'll be many a crofter who would welcome some pine marten coming that he can show to visitors. So, you know, there's an opportunity for other people to make money, but I'm really not happy with where we are now. And I wasn't happy a year ago when we discussed it, but the Minister has gone.
Thank you, Chiva. Andy Ford.
Yeah, so just to clarify a couple of those points around translocation and the efficacy of diversion refeeding. Diversion refeeding is peer-reviewed, so that the methodology is there. In terms of translocation, again, the expert stakeholder group that have worked on this haven't included translocation of pine marten into the suggested activities because as a group of experts in pine marten translocation, it wasn't deemed to be feasible. But I will come back to the point about the funding strategy, and the funding strategy that board are being asked to consider is that public money continues to support activities that deliver a wide range of public benefits that are not targeted specifically at Capercaillie conservation. The funding strategy is to deliver a wide range of benefits, including our National Park Partnership Plan targets for increasing the hectares of native woodland in the park, including the Scottish biodiversity targets or vision for functioning restored systems, including the climate change plan and the Scottish National Adaptation Plan targets for forest expansion. So the point of the funding strategy that members are being asked to consider is that public money is not targeted at single species conservation, but rather is targeted at deliver wider public benefits from which Capercaillie will benefit.
So I was just going to say, I mean, obviously the issue of pine marten is something that's, you know, we've discussed a number of times. And I mean, just to say that, I mean, what we can do is take a specific action, which is that we will undertake that population survey as soon as is possible alongside Nature Scot, and we will come back to the board with the results of that survey and what are the next steps around that in due course. So that is the next bit that we can do in that, in terms of a specific action around the pine marten side of things, because that is what we'd have to do no matter what route you want to do. That's the first port of call for any of this. So more than happy to take an action around that and to ask Nature Scot to do that work on the population side as soon as possible, to then allow us to have that discussion about what are appropriate next steps. It might be an increase in diversion feeding. It might be to look at lethal control, but, you know, we need to get that population survey first.
Can I just take the mood of the meeting that we prioritise pine marten survey with a view to that discussion with Nature Scot about next steps, whatever they may be. Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I have a caveat to that.
Sorry, Bill.
Sorry, I still am unhappy with continued expenditure on the Capercaillie project until we receive the results of this survey.
Can I just say that what Andy has made very clearly is that government money is going from the national park to habitat restoration, not to specific Capercaillie measures. So I don't know what the problem is.
On that, sorry, just to say that we've got confused here. This is not Park Authority money. So this is not us dipping into the Park Authority budget to do all this stuff. This is Scottish Forestry Grant Scheme money. This is a whole range of other organisations' money. It's a strategy for all of the approaches for funding to go. The amount of money that the Park Authority specifically spends itself on Capercaillie management is extremely small. I mean, that's the long and short. I can't remember what the funding is this year, but it'll be less than £40,000 was my memory in terms of the budget. In terms, the project has come to a close in terms of the NLHF side, and this is about how that funding, which comes from other sources, mainly through the Scottish Forest Grant Scheme for things like robo-cutting in woodlands, for things like fence removal, etc., and making sure that that is still available to do those things, which, it has to be said, a lot of estates want to do within the national park. We've got a number of estates who are wanting to do measures like grazing in woodlands, etc., which are good for a capper and good for other things, and John will attest to that. So it's that sort of thing that will continue under this. It's not Park Authority money that's going into lots of bits of this capper emergency plan.
Thanks for the clarification. We'll take points in order, and I'll ask for them briefly, please, from Anne Ross, Peter Cosgrove, Fiona McLean, Lord McCallum, Bill Lobbin, Sandra McDade.
Thank you. On the 10th of June 22, a paper came before the board with the review of Capercaillie conservation and management for decision. Point 3, the report lists the 4 options that are likely to have the greatest immediate positive impact on the population. They've been covered: predator control, diversionary feeding, reducing disturbance, and fence marking removal. And I'm being succinct here. It also goes on to say in point 4, it is unlikely that employing a single option of these will be sufficient to prevent any further population declines. Instead, action should be taken on all key areas. Now, we've talked about Pine Marten survey, but perhaps we need to also look at what other predators are there, as in foxes and crows as well. Predators in recent years have been protected, and I'm going to allude to, in my world, the magpie. I've watched the magpies are protected, is my understanding, and I watch them raid nests year after year after year. I'm not comfortable with the situation as it is, and we have an awful lot of public money, and I'm talking about public money, has been spent and is going to be spent, but more needs to be done. I'm not happy spending more unless I know that there's going to be holistic measures taking place, because it's clearly failing. Where we are just now, the numbers are declining. So what steps have been taken are clearly failing. Thank you.
Andy. Yeah, just to reassure you, you're absolutely right that this is a complex suite of activity that needs to be taken holistically. Hence, the action plan does cover as wide a range of activity as is recommended within the scope set by Scottish Government again. So I think in terms of predator control, or as I keep saying, reducing the impacts of predation, fox and crow control is in the emergency plan. That is there. The challenge with a lot of it is that the evidence base for fox and crow control is the academic evidence base, making that distinction between practitioner evidence. The academic evidence base for fox and crow control is largely in the context of a landscape from 20 years ago, and now we have a much higher increase of protected species such as mallards and pine martens. So in terms of evidence base, the stuff that's in there around fox and crow control is largely looking to equalise the scientific evidence, because at the moment the most recent scientific evidence favours diversionary feeding as an activity for reducing the impacts of predation. I think your point around what about badgers, what about magpies is exactly the right point, which is the SAC report identified that pine marten is a new factor, but it is not the factor. It is a new factor in the round of the impacts of
predators on Kappa. The SAC report specifically says you cannot say the decrease in chick survival is because of pine marten, but pine marten are an additional factor. The reason that the SAC report didn't pick into badgers is because there is no current evidence on badgers or the impacts of badger predation on capercaillie. So it isn't a simple picture, and there will need to be a number of policy tests and principles, as I keep saying, that would be applied when looking at predator management, and it will need to pick apart a very complex picture. And as Grant points out, the first step towards that is the study of the pine marten population.
Could I come back, please?
Briefly, please. Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, but pine martens are clearly, you're saying the new phenomenon here, but they need to, as Jeeva has said, be relocated. But something needs to be done because you haven't got time on your side. That's what I'm getting here. We're putting, and I don't like to use the expression "good money after bad" because I don't feel that the capercaillie are bad. But you haven't the way public. You've got two dilemmas. A, you want to save the capercaillie, and B, the public purse is not deep nowadays. So you need to do something, and you need to do something quickly. And if it means relocating or controlling the pine martens, then that's what needs to happen now. You haven't got a timeline where you can just wait and wait and wait and wait, because you've been doing that for 10 years.
Right. We have several board members looking to make points. I'll simply ask that they be fresh points, not already made, and made briefly, please. So we've got Peter Cosgrove, Fiona McLean, Lauren McCallum, Bill Lobbin, Sandra McDade, John Kirk, and Steve Micklewright. Peter.
2 points to make, Andy. Based on the comments received around the table, I think it might be quite useful to have a succinct summary on the wider benefits, not just to capercaillie, that public funding of capercaillie has done. It might be just a useful thing so that we can see what else has happened, expansion of woodland, other biodiversity benefits, etc. I think it would be useful for us to see that. That would be a first point. And my second one is in relation to the discussion about pine martens and the predator guilds. I wonder if you could say something on the consideration that's being made towards the introduction and release of mass pheasants across the park and surrounding the park, and its role in building up these predator guilds. We know that there's more pheasants around than pretty much into biomass of any other British bird, in fact all birds put together. So if you could say something about the role of consideration of pheasants in predation, that would be quite helpful.
Yep, just to reassure that part of the governance of delivery of the emergency plan includes establishing a new scientific advisory group. Hasn't got a name yet, but I'll call it that, which would bring together all those experts again. And there is a research chapter in the emergency plan, and quite happy to propose to that new group at some point that impacts of game bird release suggested as a topic for them to consider as the supporting research work.
Thank you. Thank you. Fiona McLean.
No, my comments have been superseded. Steve and Grant have covered them. Thank you.
Thank you. Lauren McCallum.
Yeah, really interesting discussion, and I think just to kind of pick up on the divisiveness of this, and just if it's becoming, as heated in here, imagine how heated it is in our communities. Just to raise that point, in the reducing disturbance with the mountain bike management plan for Deeside and Bainoch and Strathspey, I was just interested in what that would include, because there was a bit of feeling within the wider mountain bike community that there was money there to build new trails, or to, I guess, repair the ones that were there. No, sorry, not repair the ones that were there, to kind of build on the network. Because I feel like, yeah, the message that's been received, especially by my network of friends that I go mountain biking with, is that, there's quite a lot of money, again, being pumped in, but there's nothing really, and we're engaging, but there's nothing really to see at the end of it. So yeah, I just want to kind of seek clarification on that, because yeah, if it's £100,000 and again we've got nothing to show for it, I'm starting to feel a little bit nervous.
Okay, so yeah, reducing disturbance is one of the key drivers of decline. The mountain bike work that I know of in Badenoch and Strathspey has unlocked significant amount of habitat by reducing fragmentation from disturbance for a start, and has also done the fantastic work actually of involving people who aren't normally involved in kappa conservation and showing that everybody can play a part, however big or small that can be. Impacts are cumulative. The impacts of work are undoubtedly cumulative. And again, by focusing, in this case, perhaps more public resource than public money on reducing disturbance, it's delivering the wider benefits of involving communities in conservation, raising awareness and understanding, and it's also minimising disturbance for a whole suite of species, not just capercaillie. So again, that emphasis on delivering the wider public benefits and not focusing specifically on targeting public money at the sole beneficiary of capercaillie, but a wider suite of outcomes, both public and conservation.
Thank you. Again, looking for fresh points made briefly. Bill Lobbin.
Nothing very much fresh, but the CCP are talking about spending an additional £3 million of taxpayers' money on a failed project.
Sandra McDade.
Just to say on that, it's not the CCP, but the Cairngorms Kappa project has come to an end. Finished this week. In terms of, this is funding from different partners who are involved in the group, who are looking to bring forward things to do on Kappa, which is supported by a large amount of land managers out in the park. So it's not the Cairngorms Kappa project. It's not.
Sandra McDade.
I suppose this brings me on to my point, actually, which is I want to get some clarity around the money side. I think that seems to be a lot of the discussion in the room is the money. I think I've got 3 points to this I'd like to get an understanding of, which I think everyone would probably benefit. How much is the CMPA putting in, going forward out of this? So Grant sort of mentioned a £40,000 figure for last year, but I think it would just be helpful to understand what our money going forward is going to be, as it were. How much of the work that's mentioned in the fundraising strategy would be spent as part of either ours or others, as it were, normal business? So, it's being mentioned here, but I'm thinking a lot of it we would be doing anyway, and we may well be doing anyway. So I just want to understand how much of that is either ours or others' normal work, and it's being included in here, but would happen anyway. And the final bit is effectively, by badging this as a piece of work, how much is that bringing in terms of partnership funding from other sources?
Yeah, no, thanks, Andrew. And I think that I can give you the figure in the line for the Kappa emergency plan for resource in terms of cash is £9,000 from the Park Authority. So that is what's in this year's budget. There is other funding in a different line, which is around work on Kappa itself, which I think comes to about another £40,000 in total. So that's the Park Authority contribution at the moment in terms of Kappa management. You're absolutely right. Within the overall funding package, there are things that will be happening anyway from SFGS and things where people are already being paid to do things like woodland grazing. We've already got people doing woodland grazing in the park, where we've already paying for enhanced fox and crow control. There's diversion feeding already happening both in Deeside and in the wider Strathspey area as well. And then there are some specific interventions around that. We will have also some budgets against things like the Lick It Bee campaign within the communication side of things, and obviously rangers doing some of those patrols in the morning is a cost to the Park Authority in terms of staff time. So we can get an overall figure in terms of exactly what's going in from the Park Authority to that. But it's not a case of there's lots of new money coming in to Capercaillie side. What we're saying is we want to try and use what we have better, the focus on the things that we think make the most impact, and that if we do this, we think there is a good chance. that we will still have capercaillie. We cannot say that we will definitely not have capercaillie in 10 years' time. Nobody knows what the future holds. They were meant to go extinct in the early 2000s. The work that has been done has kept capercaillie within this area. It is a complex issue, and what we think we've got here is the best way forward. I was going to suggest that this was how to break the other part, which is that the emergency plan covers a whole range of stuff, specifically on the pine marten side of things. I think it would be worth writing specifically from Sandy to the Minister to say that there is a wider point around pine marten side of things, that we want to see the survey done as quickly as possible so that there can be a further discussion. And the other thing is that Scottish Government have just set up with Nature Scot, along with NFUS, SLE and a few others, and we'll be involved as well, a Wildlife and Species Forum, which is exactly trying to tackle some of these issues in Scotland, which is how do all these things fit together. So I think there's a way of linking all these things together for Sandy to write to the Minister and to get a bit more of a political input into this in terms of where that sits at a Scottish Government level, because ultimately these decisions on that will only be decided and can only be decided through Nature Scot and the Scottish Government. And I think it's probably quite a good way to do that, to make sure the emergency plan and all the work that people want to do on Capper, and there's lots of people involved in this who want to make this thing work, happens. And at the same time, we try and make that other bit happen quicker so that we can then come back and have an informed decision.
I do think we need to engage the Minister directly on this issue, and I'm more than happy to do that. Sander wants to come back.
Yeah, thanks. So just I think then for clarity, so if we weren't to proceed with the recovery plan as set out, for example, just hypothetically, the saving to the authority is about £50,000. That's it would be money that would go back into circulation and would be used elsewhere, but actually that's all we're talking about really, is about £50,000 of budget, and from our point of view, and the rest of this money is coming out as other partners' money, effectively, that they are committing and are likely to potentially spend anyway doing some of this stuff.
Yeah, on some of that, I mean, other people, I mean, if the emergency plan isn't approved and we didn't do it, then would people put money into diversionary feeding and things like that? You might find those things stop and slow down as well. So, that's the cost. But yeah, the direct cost of the Park Authority is we would stop spending X amount of money. Now, obviously, we approved that money for this financial year in terms of that was the budget that was approved in March. But in terms of future spend, that's obviously in terms of what we want to put in for the budget next year. But that's the long and short of it.
Andy Ford.
Yeah, just a bit of clarification on that funding strategy. So, yeah, there's already a significant amount of money that comes into the National Park on woodland creation through the Forest Grant Scheme. That funds, by and large, most of the expansion of the capercaillie habitat, and will continue to come into the park irrespective of an emergency plan. What the emergency plan does is it enables the limited amount of public money to be targeted at where public money will deliver the most benefit, but it is already coming into the park in terms of woodland expansion. What we may be able to do through this is target it at where it will deliver multiple benefits. I think just to clarify your point, Bill, around the Cairngorms Capercaillie project, the funding strategy uses the Capper project as an example of how a blended model of finance has been very successful. So a relatively limited amount of public money has drawn in investment from lots of different sources to a total of 3 million, and it's using that and upscaling that approach. So using public money, which is already coming in to the park for habitat expansion and enhancement, and as Grant says, there are already forest grant schemes around woodland enhancement, etc., around fox and crow control, etc., and it's using that money to catalyse further investment from, well, there are charitable organisations that are already contributing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds into Capper conservation because there is a commitment, broadly speaking, across the public sector into providing the long-term resilience in the habitat. Having this kind of strategy in place with the Cairngorms Capercaillie project has demonstrated if you have that core set of commitment, then inward investment, in this case from a charity, into fence removal has been catalysed by the fact that there is a lot of activity and commitment in the area. Without that project without that broader coordination role that the Park Authority can take, I think it's extremely unlikely that those tens of thousands of pounds into fence removal would have been invested in the park by a third party, by a charitable organisation. And that is essentially what the funding strategy is saying, is let's use the money that we're investing in things that deliver multiple benefits, that we're already investing in, that deliver much public support, that benefit more widely. Let's use that to draw in third-party investment, be that philanthropic, and there are already lots of philanthropic interests in Capercaillie conservation. Let's use this strategy to identify the bits that the public purse won't pay for and say, here's how you can make your contribution, and it fits within the wider, bigger funding package. The overall outcome, the overall costs are in there in the funding strategy, as is the sort of rationale I've just explained. The one thing that we could do is identify how much, is already going in and how much isn't, because it's a really important point to note that the public sector has been funding a lot of this for a long time. This isn't additional money, but the key thing is, if we want to do fence removal at the scale and the speed that's been recommended that we need to do, if we want to do that, then the current forest grant scheme is not sufficient. It will not cover the scale and the speed at which we need to remove fences, for example, and it will need further investment. The forest grant scheme, as it stands, is not sufficient to fund the fence removal that's recommended we need to take on. And the funding strategy says, well, let's continue to fund what we can whilst we can, but where does the rest of that challenge fund come from?
Thank you. I'm now looking for final brief points and fresh points.
Okay, thank you. I'll try and not go over too much of what's been said already. Go back to the last paper on Gaelic. In Gaelic, the pine marten is the tree cat. That's how it's described in Gaelic. But one of the problems with these predators is they kill everything. If they go into a hen house, they kill the lot. They just don't take one hen, they take the whole they kill the whole lot and walk off. And that is part of the problem with that type of beast.
2 seconds, John.
I think so.
We're almost there.
Fighting.
We made it rain, as soon as it started to close and the clouds came back.
Sean.
I think the motor's now jammed. Thank you. So they kill for the sake of killing, and now we've got wildcats now starting to breed in the area as well. So that's going to put further pressure onto the Capercaillie. I agree with everybody. Will the public accept more money being spent? I doubt they will. We had one of the biggest lakes in Europe at Carline, just outside the road out at Granton here, and unfortunately the ground was sold, and change in management absolutely seen it wiped out. Diversity feeding was already done at Forest Lodge, as far as I'm aware, and I don't think that was much success. But what I do think is successful is grazing in the forests. And I think one of the problems we've got in our forests, there's far too much cover. The stuff's away up here, nothing can land in it. And we've got to get this stuff down, whether it's robo-cutting. I'm not just a robo-cut fan. I think it just makes it's more a rotavator than a robo-cut. And, with the argument on more woodland, well, I think with the amount of planting that's been done, we are heading that direction anyway. And I still doubt this fencing thing. I've talked to many's an old keeper, and they all say they've never seen anything stuck in a fence. There are very, very few. I just don't know. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Sean.
Thanks. The paper's called Capercaillie Emergency Plan, Andy, and then now you're trying to say, oh, it's for the whole habitat and natural habitat. But as soon as you see Capercaillie emergency plan, then locally people are just going more money on Capercaillie. I mean, I'm sure you understand that yourself. I mean, that's because over the years we've had all the different things, and as people have said already, it's probably failed, and yet here we are again. And I mean, you're talking about just to move on to a different point, as the convener has asked us to do. I mean, you say that you want to ensure that access rights are not restricted while minimising disturbance. I'm not entirely sure how you do that, and that's on point 22. And then 2D, you say, develop and deliver active Cairngorms action plan, including proposals to reduce disturbance. So behind Remuish, I mean, down where I live, around Bangorm, there's a proposed quiet area to keep mountain bikers away. And apparently the plan is to build mountain bike trails at Feshy Bridge, and I take it that's what the £100,000 are for. But I mean, what happens in another 2 years' time if a capper happens to wander in about Feshy Bridge and about those trails? I mean, it's just seems to be one thing after another, and we never see, there's more and more public money spent, whether it's park money or whatever, it's public money. And yeah, as I say, I'm still struggling with it, to be honest with you.
Andy? Yeah, I think that is essentially at the crux of it, which is where do we put any further resource if we do? I mean, I think the thing about it being a Capercaillie emergency plan is that specifically what the request is, and it is specifically what a lot of stakeholders are asking for. I think again, that point about what's included in the emergency plan are the emergency measures for the next 3 to 5 years, or however long the length of the strategy is, 2030, which those are the next emergency measures that we need to do. But in the context of those emergency measures is the long-term resilience of the species. And the point of the funding strategy is saying some of those short-term measures that don't deliver wider benefits, they shouldn't be funded by public money. They should be, charitable donations, philanthropic donations, etc. So the Capercaillie emergency plan, investment in habitat, you can't disentangle the two completely, is the point. And so it is part of Capercaillie conservation. The thing about disturbance, how is it done without affecting access rights? Again, it has a lot of support from the access community, the approach which says it is a graduation of approaches. First thing is you put a sign up that says, would you mind, please, not using this area between this time and this time because you may impact Capercaillie. It does not mean enforcement. It means an approach that looks for the voluntary contribution, as the mountain bike workers already really successfully demonstrated.
Thank you, Andy. Final points, please, from Chiva and Steve Micklewright.
Yeah, thank you. We've concentrated a lot on recommendation A, but I'd like to ask you about recommendation B, which is a recommendation that we agree that the funding strategy is appropriate and sufficient to meet requirements, but don't actually save the capper. How confident can you be that the philanthropist will buy into a funding strategy that has unknowns on the budget for the whole of the habitat expansion and enhancement section, diversionary feeding and site specific interventions, but predation is not being adequately addressed?
Yeah, reasonably confident, because as I say, we've already had donations from charitable organisations into certain aspects of the plan, and the idea behind the funding strategy as is laid out is that people can define particular aspects that meet and corresponded with their particular organisational objectives and aspirations. So we have had approaches from other philanthropic organisations saying, I'm interested in funding this particular aspect of it. I'm not interested in that bit. That's not for us. That doesn't align with our corporate or philanthropic values, but that bit does. I would like to contribute and make my part to Capercaillie conservation by funding that bit of it. And that essentially is what we're what the proposed funding strategy is trying to enable and get across. But to answer your question, yeah, pretty confident because we've already had those approaches. Thank you, Andy. Steve.
Yeah, I actually going to try and say, but I wasn't going to say it as eloquently as Xander said about what the funding mix is. And I think the funding mix is the crucial thing here. And I think the funding strategy kind of thinks like millions on Capercaillie that we pay for, but the Cairngorms National Park or public funding, if I understand Andy correctly, will help to give other funders confidence to put money into other measures that are species specific. So I think that for me is the take home point of the way Andy's put this together. And I think that's quite smart, Andy. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. So we've had a good airing of concerns and reservations. So is the board content to support the recommendations with the key provisions that the Pine Martin survey is prioritised to provide an evidence base for any action to protect Capercaillie, and that I write to the Minister to reflect the concerns expressed today by the board? Yes.
Sorry, I'd like to make that last bit stronger. Can you just read what you said again?
That last bit, that I write to the Minister to reflect the concerns expressed by this board.
And ask for an emergency discussion. You know, we cannot continue to leave this. You know, you phrased it really nicely, convener-wise, Andy-wise, in the way that you do. But actually, you know, I think we've heard around this table today that people are really, really concerned. And we cannot, you know, this paper came to us originally 2 years ago. We need to get this sorted. If more money is going to be spent, whether it's public or private, we need to sort it.
Yeah. I mean, we work under the framework agreement. The board's responsible to deliver in accordance with the priorities of Scottish ministers, but I'm happy to go beyond this and to seek a meeting with the minister to discuss this specific issue.
Thank you.
I'm happy to proceed on that basis.
Could we ask for a timeline on it so that we would have some feedback? When would we have some feedback about what's happening?
You'll get feedback once the request is made, yes. Content on that basis? Thank you, board. Thank you. Moving on to item 10, paper 6, minutes from. I'll ask Fiona McLean as chair of the Audit and Risk Committee to give us an update in just a moment. But first I'll ask David Cameron, Director of Corporate Services and Deputy CEO, to introduce the minutes, and we'll take any points by exception. David.
Thanks, Convener. I don't think I've got anything to say really by way of introduction. That they are for information and they're supplied to board members to allow for any points that any members see in the minutes to take up with relevant officers or indeed relevant members that are on the committee, and therefore really an information point, Convener, and we would normally only pick up anything that at this board by way of exception if there's anything of strategic significance to the board as a whole.
Is there anything of strategic significance by exception? No, thank you very much. The board's asked to note the minutes from the committee meetings. Thank you very much. I'll now ask Fiona to give us an update from the Audit and Risk Committee. Fiona.
Thank you, Convener. It's at the Audit and Risk Committee meeting, which we held on the 21st of June, so you don't have the minutes in your papers there. We received the internal auditor's report, which reviewed the processes and procedures for procurement within the Park Authority. The auditors identified 7 improvement actions, 4 of which are high priority. They identified significant gaps in coverage of our internal controls and recommended that our procurement systems should be more strategy and process driven rather than relying on key individual staff and their interventions. Now, the committee had, as you can imagine, a long and detailed discussion with the auditors and with our management to satisfy ourselves that sufficient controls are being put in place to address the auditor's recommendations. So I'm now bringing this to the attention of the board, and I can assure you that the committee will continue to review progress. An action plan which sets out the actions to be taken to improve the Park Authority's processes and controls was agreed by the committee. Myself as chair and Peter as vice chair will get monthly updates on progress on the action plan, while the full committee will be updated at its meetings until we are satisfied that sufficient progress has been made. The committee has satisfied itself with confirmation from the auditors and assurances from management that there is no evidence that procurement requirements have not been met. And management also confirmed that there have been no challenges to our approaches to the market for supply of services. So it's clear that the issue centres around the adequacy of our systems to evidence processes without the intervention of key staff and the collation of appropriate documentation. To be fair, procurement activity has increased considerably over the past few years, and it's become obvious that a much more systematic approach to procurement is required. So having brought this to the attention of the board and assured you that the Audit and Risk Committee will closely monitor progress on implementation of the action plan on procurement, I'll update the board in due course on the monitoring of that progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, and thanks to members of the Audit and Risk Committee. Any questions on Fiona's report? Thank you very much. Item 10, any other competent business? Nothing has been notified. Item 11 is the date of the next formal board meeting, which is the 13th of September. It'll be at Rothwell in the Angus Glens. And I'm delighted to say that Scottish Forestry will be attending the evening session with lots of issues raised around work involving them at previous informal board discussions. We look forward to convening then as a formal board. Meetings before then, obviously. Thank you very much, members, and thank you, staff. Safe journey home.
Thank you. Thank you.